Hello and welcome to the Color Mentor podcast. My name is Paul Hanrahan. I'm a colorist, originally from South Africa. Now I'm based in Taiwan. On this podcast, I'm going to be talking to people who have mentored and inspired me on my color grading journey over the years. So welcome to the show. If you'd like to learn more about color grading, you can head over to my Patreon. It's called Color Mentor at patreon.com, and it includes test footage, color charts, basic skill training, all the way up to full coursework on various topics. I also offer one-on-one mentoring for those who want to refine their craft further. But without further ado, let's get on with the show. In this episode, I chat to Kevin Shaw. He's a well-known colorist and educator in our industry, and he helped set up and promote the Colorist Society. That's actually the topic of our following episode, but in this episode we talk about telecines. Kevin started in the industry 10 years before I did, at a time when color grading was either telecine or film lab based. Probably the main difference between then and now was the smaller number of colorists and suites. It cost in the region of $1 million to set up a suite, and they were costly to maintain. They required a team of trained operators and engineers, not to mention service contracts and costly updates. Film was very much still the primary capture medium for television and the display medium in cinemas. That was before digital cinema projectors. The telecines that we operated were a key part in these workflows. They scanned film and output video in real time. They had no storage, and initially were used to broadcast films live on television or later record their output signal to videotape. They were proprietary hardware and software systems made in the UK, USA, and Europe, with custom machine parts, printed circuit boards, state-of-the-art microchips, and software interfaces coded on Unix platforms. The grading tools were still in their infancy when compared to today. We only had lift gamma gain, master saturation and hue, 6 color vectors, and custom curves. Year by year, the toolset improved though, but color management was a dark art that not many people knew about. On the topic of history, Kevin's website, finalcolor.com, under resources, has a section called History for Colorists, which is a great listing of technical and creative events that have happened in our industry through many years, so go check that out. We discuss various stages that the industry has gone through since then and all the way up to the present. So I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the Color Mentor podcast. I've been looking forward to having this chat because you've definitely played a part in mentoring me at some stages. So yeah, I think we've got a lot to talk about in terms of telecines and how things used to be, and a great reflection on things today. So welcome.
Yeah, it's going to be really good to catch up and yes, discuss how things have changed. We've seen a lot of changes, you and I. But
yeah, nowadays I get the feeling it's like day by day, week by week. Okay. It's all new now. The asymptote we're going into.
Yeah, I do get a kick though out of something being called new and then realizing that, actually we did all this back in the film days.
I like to remind myself it's still storytelling at the end of the day.
I think that's the most important thing. And, in recent years, I've kind of got a little bit interested in the color science, with color management and HDR and so on. But you're right. At the end of the day, it's telling a story. And I do like to remind people that, well, it always used to be called a renaissance. I mean, that was where the Davinci term came from. It's a renaissance science, that you needed the science to do the art.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I think about it a lot personally, but in terms of every episode that I've done on the podcast, it always feels like a balance of that, like the art and the science and how these two the two gears grind on each other. Because I've always felt being creative is literally, okay, look around, what do you have? What do you want to make? Or, it's some iteration of that, whether we were, as a young 20-year-old or whatever, I was chucked into, finally given responsibility enough to go and let loose on a job and just go for it and twiddle those lift gamma gain wheels and come up with something, or painting or sculpture or whatever. It does methodologically, it's never far away from that.
It's true. And I was, as a colorist, of course, we weren't called, when I started, we weren't called colorists. We were called telecine engineers.
Engineers?
And I was the first generation. Well, because prior to when I started, you had to be an engineer to run a telecine. That, remote desks and things like that didn't exist.
Yeah.
And so I was probably the first, well, not probably, I was definitely the first generation to come in with a creative background and not come in through an engineering route.
Right.
And then a few years later, the Americans decided that they wanted to distinguish themselves, as not being engineers and being creatives. And so the term colorist was coined. But,
right.
Back when I started, you spent more time with a tweaker probably than actually turning joybots.
That was my question. Did you have a tweaker?
Okay, yeah, no, absolutely.
Side note, a tweaker is a very small screwdriver, which you have to have if you're going anywhere near a Betacam, a digital Betacam, or any other tape machine.
Well, we used it on the Telecine because there were a lot of things that could only be adjusted with a tweaker. They weren't on the remote desk. In those days, there weren't standalone color grading desks. You basically just remoted what was in the Telecine.
Right.
And we even there we had some creative moments, abusing the Telecine, as it were.
Right.
But yeah, that was the start. It was a mixture of engineering and color, and of course I had no engineering background, and so I relied for many years. I relied totally on inspiration rather than actually knowledge, and just trying things that the engineers wouldn't dream of trying. And I spent 3 years doing just a ton of music videos.
Right.
That was my introduction.
To just set the time here, what year are we talking? And is this in an independent facility, or is this linked to television stations?
No, I didn't work for a television station. So we're talking 1984 was my first grading job, my first telecine job. And it was in a facility that actually specialized in medical films.
Wow.
But I was lucky enough to have a really good mentor, and he was very creative, and he did a lot of commercial and music videos. He had a reputation for the music videos.
Right.
And so he encouraged me to play, and he, I realized some years later that some of the things he told me were only training wheels. He told me those things so that I actually learned properly. And so those were rules to be broken later. But I kind of listened to him pretty much religiously in the early days. He unfortunately got out of the industry and became an air traffic controller, I think.
What?
Yeah.
Telecine wasn't very exciting enough.
Well, he was good at it, but he wasn't ambitious in the sense. And he just got out.
Yeah. Okay. So you said you had an artistic background, but did you study art at university?
My first career was in insurance, actually, because I went to a grammar school and they didn't like me focusing on the arts. They said, you need something more scientific or mathematical in my case. So I had a Lloyd's ticket. I was working at Lloyd's of London as an insurance broker doing nuclear power stations and things.
Whoa. Yeah.
After a few years of that, I just felt that this isn't going to be very satisfying for the rest of my life. So in those days, it was very different because I was now an independent, living apart from my parents and independent of them. And so I decided to go back to art school to do an art foundation course because that was really what I wanted to do. And because I was independent, I immediately got a grant. So I didn't have to, none of this loans business where I had to pay it back or anything like that.
Right.
I just got a full grant to do an art foundation for a year.
Brilliant.
And I thought, well, that'll sort me out. I'll figure out what I want to do because I wanted to be an illustrator, really. But it turned out I wasn't very good at that. So I was going to leave, or I was at the end of the foundation course and I had a job in a wine bar. I was managing a wine bar. The school that I'd been doing this art course at said, well, you have to apply to university because it looks bad for us if you don't go to university afterwards.
Right.
So as a mature student, everybody else in the class was like 16, 17. I was 24, 25 at that time. And I said, well, yeah, about university, because I had the opportunity to go to university, but I had refused to go on the grounds that I wasn't really sure what to study. And I knew you only got one crack at it. That was the thing.
Right, yeah, big commitment, 3 years, 4 years for sure.
Yeah. So having learned that I wasn't really much good at painting and illustrating, one of my general studies was photography. And I had a bit of a background in photography, but never really taken it very seriously. But the photographic instructor said, I think you have a bit of an eye. I think that you would do very well in photography. Why don't you apply for that? So sort of tick the box. I said, sure. What's the best course in the country? And they said, oh, that would be the London College of Printing. It's the London College of Communication now, I think.
Right.
And I said, well, let's apply there then. And they said, oh, no, because nobody ever gets in there. That would be terrible. And I said, well, you can't have it both ways. You want me to apply? That's what I'm going to apply for.
Let's go big. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's go big or go home. And so I got into it because it turns out they were much keener to take on mature students than school leavers. They wanted people with a bit of something to talk about.
Yeah, you knew what you wanted. You weren't going to muck about.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I did a BA honors degree in photography, film, and television. And whilst film was really what I was interested in, I was on a grant, but you had to pay for all your own materials, and I couldn't afford to make films. It was way too expensive for me. So I focused in photography. And when I left there, I came out as a professional photographer, doing some magazine work and some art printing and stuff like that. But cash flow was poor. So I got a job as a runner at the moving picture company in London,
right,
in their studios, because obviously I had a bit of a background and I could do that. And I was a terrible runner, apparently, because I was a runner for a year, which was unheard of. Mostly you got a job after 2 or 3 months, and I was there for a year. I did everything in that place, from the library to technical cleaning to literally dropping off tapes and things, everything. I applied for a ton of jobs, and eventually I got a job as an assistant at this company, Telecine Limited. Clue was in the name.
Right.
And they were mostly doing dubs for playouts and things, commercials and stuff. But they had this one colorist, and he had this shiny CCD telecine, which was very unusual. I think there was only a few in London. Most of them were the rank CRT-based telecines.
Right.
And they had invested in CCD for news programs and medical stuff. And it was very cool. One of the cool things about it was it could run at 6.25 frames per second, which was very popular in music videos on Super 8.
Yeah.
It was a brilliant effect. So we got a lot of work on that.
So they shoot at 6 and you telecine at 6. So it's still real time, but all smeared. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's in sync, but it looks animated. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting technology. And after I'd been assisting for about a year, they bought a remote desk for it. And then I think a year after that, one of our clients had been to America and worked on an analog Davinci in the early 80s. And
wow,
and they said, you should really get one of these. Yeah. I mean, that was something very special. But luckily, we managed to get the company to invest in that. And in due course, they invested in a second telecine as well.
And was it still kind of $1 million a pop kind of thing? Or was it prices lower then?
Would have been a little bit lower because it didn't do anywhere near the sort of things that the digital systems did.
Right.
And of course, they didn't do anywhere near what the software systems did.
Yeah.
So I think we're probably talking about hundreds of thousands rather than millions.
Right.
And it was nice because, once we got the telecine didn't change much. We did later upgrade to an FDL90. But what happened was that Davinci would bring out a new feature about once a year, and it would cost you sort of somewhere between $20,000 and $30,000 to upgrade to this new feature. But the way I looked at it was that you had a year to exploit every single possible way of using this new feature. And so once you got the basics down, and of course I'd spent a year just understanding the telecine basics, then each year you would have a year to spend studying a new feature and getting the most out of it, and then moving on to the next one. And that's what I did. And pretty early on, sort of the late 1980s,
right?
Not that old. The late 1980s, Davinci started asking me to do demos for them at trade shows. Well, the product manager at that time was doing training for Davinci, and he left. And they asked me to take over the training program. And Brilliant. So that was how I got into that.
I guess in that stage, it was all employee. There was no such thing as freelance, really.
No, I don't remember anybody being freelance because you needed access to this telecine, and the telecine needed quite a lot of support.
Yeah,
it was hugely, obviously expensive. I mean, nobody would privately own a telecine. Although there was some years later, there was a guy that bought a second-hand telecine. A company went bust, and he bought the telecine and put it in his front room.
Wow.
And threw his hat in with one of the music video production companies.
Right.
And and he did pretty well. But yeah, freelance wasn't really a thing, and it was union when I started as well, so that was a thing too.
Come full circle on that.
Yes.
I mean, I guess people don't actually know what a telecine is. So I was thinking of going into, I mean, the obviously you're talking about a whole earlier generation, but what I was told about telecines is that they were the way in, one of their uses was that they were the way in which movies that were actually on 35mm film were shown on TV.
Yes.
Play at, reel one, like it's in 4 reels, 20-minute reels, and they'd end the announcer would say their segment, they'd have a commercial, and then they'd have a vision mixer going 3, 2, 1, go.
Oh, no.
And then the telecine would play.
No. Okay, so that was kind of the period before I got into it.
Right.
Although they were still doing that, I think, in some places. So this is how it panned out. Early television was the early 1950s, really, when it started to be truly public.
Right.
That is before the first videotape machines. So there was no way to record programs.
Exactly. And telecine, just to say, telecines are live. They have no frame buffer. They have no recording. You push play and it plays, and you step or play backwards, play forward. It's a live signal, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a projector with a video camera on the end of it. That's essentially what it is.
Right.
And so in the days before there were videotape recorders, you had 2 types of programs. You had live programming, which would be things like news programs and game shows. That's where game shows came from. And if you wanted anything pre-recorded, it would be a movie that would be projected direct from a telecine. And you would have 2 telecines. You wouldn't have a vision mixer. You'd have 2 telecines, and they would rehearse it. You couldn't in those days, you couldn't preset the gradings. You had to do it live.
Set 2 endpoints and run up. Yeah.
There was no time code, so you couldn't do that. So you had to grade it live, and what they would do is they would literally switch broadcast from one telecine to the other.
Yeah.
In order to do it.
And the people there just like smoking cigarettes. Look, we got it. This is your life depends on getting this edit right.
I remember coming home from the pub one evening and watching a movie on late night TV. And reel 1 was letterbox and reel 2 wasn't, because the 2 telecines hadn't been set up with the same settings. And people used to put the reels up in the wrong order and all sorts of stuff. It was horrible, actually. But it was the only way you could do it.
There's a Taiwanese director who made a film called Blue Moon back in the high period of Taiwan cinema, and the deal was that it was 5 reels, and you could play them in any order, and it was up to the projectionist on the night which order they were going to go, and it would still make some kind of sense.
That's a novel idea. That sounds very interactive. We should probably bring that back.
Yeah. Choose your own adventure.
Yeah. So anyway, the first videotape machines came in around 1957, 58, I think. They were huge. They were the size of a desk.
Right.
And the quad machines. But by the time I got into it, that was the older generation. Like I say, some of the broadcasters still did that, but for the most part, we had time code and we could program. You couldn't play out. Well, yeah. So what would happen in those days the first telecines I remember, you would go through and rehearse it and put your marks in, and then you would play it out real time. Because remember, you had to record it to videotape, and that could only be recorded in real time.
Yeah.
So you'd rehearse all the marks, and then you'd play it out to tape. In the case of the analog Davinci, the problem with that is it was very sensitive to heat. And so you had to play it back pretty quickly, because if the temperature changed, it would all look different to the way that you graded it.
I mean, you can tweak live, right? So I remember tweaking stuff. Well, going crazy and tweaking stuff live for a second pass of a music video, just twirling and twirling. But yeah, you could subtly ease up.
Yeah, I got into trouble doing that one time because I was doing it across a blue screen shot, and the editor said, "Oh, look, you kept changing it while it was going through, and now it's really difficult to key." And I think I said, "No, I didn't." And he said, "Come and have a look." And then on the vector scope, you could see the blue wobbling all over the place.
Green, purple, yellow.
So I learned, not to over tweak it. But that got better and better.
Just to think about that, the heartbeat of a facility was the sync generator, and it had to go to every, the whole, dong, dong, dong. The drummer that was keeping every machine in the whole place was one probably like rack mount sync generator that was being fed through those patch bays to everyone.
Yeah, that was a big part of it.
The one time that I telecinied a porno, the entire facility, because remember the facility was all had those comms, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's the comms on the desk. You push the button, like you want to speak, talk back. You want to speak to the machine room. You want to speak to, and there were everyone on every single suite, including clients. They'd obviously patched my signal through so that they were watching what I was watching. Just this pornographic, like shot on film, whatever. I don't even know. Through the casinos at Sun City or just something. And the clients were yelling through the comms to me. I'm not even going to say what they were going to say, but anyway, yeah, it was it's a different vibe. You know, it had that very, you know, it was quite a communal vibe in a facility, right?
Yes. I mean, yes, you're right. Those talkbacks.
Working together to construct something, and you were all there, and yeah.
Well, because we didn't have remotes. I mean, as an assistant, my job was to sit in the machine room where it was freezing cold, pressing play and record, and rewinding the tape to where he wanted to cut back in and all that sort of thing. So because we didn't have remote control in that sense, it did exist. But it was way too expensive for the Telecine suite. The Telecine suite was very much the hand-me-down. Wow. So we didn't get things like defocus until the edit suites had finished with this other unit called the Abekus, right, which did some quite nice defocus. And so we didn't get defocus in these hardware Telecine bays until the editors were throwing those out for the next generation of whatever it was. And then the colorists were saying, oh, yeah, I could use that. Don't throw it away. Put it in my suite. I can use that.
Yeah, then it like frame store. What? Oh yeah, you need a frame store. That's a whole nother device. And like it's manual. You go clicking through like job 1, job 2, and just tick, 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 tick. Oh, here's the reference.
There were two big things I remember about the frame store. So yes, again, those got thrown out. And we're talking about...
It's full now, so you got to delete it.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're talking about 30 seconds of frame right. store. That cost a fortune, you know.
Yeah.
And there were two main uses for it. One of them was for a commercial. We would try and assemble the commercial, because remember, we were always working in film order,
right? And
it was often useful to be able to see what it would look like after the edit. So we would just kind of do a rough cut so we could see how it cut together and make sure that the grades were good. So that was one use. But the main use, the main argument for having one in the Telecine bay was that Telecines were not that stable. And so we would have a thing called a steady gate, which would be doing like a frame every couple of seconds or something. It was like really slow.
Yeah.
And so all the visual effects work, we didn't have auto stabilization or anything like that. So all the visual effects work had to go through this steady gate, and you had to lay it off, because you can't lay it off a frame at a time onto tape. That only plays in real time. So you had to lay that off onto a frame store. And typically, you know, we'd put the film up, grade it, and then kick it off, and you'd come back, you know, go to the pub and come back 3 or 4 hours later and hope that it had finished. What would sometimes happen is it would rip a sprocket or something, and right. then you've still only got one frame on tape, or on the frame store rather. And if it was more than 30 seconds, of course, you had to come back, dump it, as you say, and then kick it off again. And you could be there for very long hours. And that's what I remember about those days. Telecine was a minimum of 12 hours a day, and often 16 hours a day. My working week was typically between 80 and 100 hours. And I think I went above that on a few occasions.
And loving it, probably.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, because, you got to imagine that the only way into color grading in those days was to be in one of these rooms with a Telecine and a grading system and some tape decks. Yeah. And as you say, later on, a digital kind of defocus or edit switcher and frame stores and all these sort of things. So it was a lot of money. It was not something that you could kind of just do in your spare time.
Yeah, very elitist.
And so nobody wanted to put a trainee into the room to learn during the daytime. That was the billing time. So if you wanted to get into the business, you would assist during the day, and they would let you do what you want in the evening. And typically we would kind of do low cost music videos in the middle of the night. So it was very long days. But once you got a clientele, then you could start booking it during the day.
What are we talking in terms of tools? Obviously, lift, gamma, gain, and probably master saturation, master hue, secondaries, not yet.
No, we did have so that was one of the advantages of the FDL telecines is they did have a 6-vector secondary system.
Oh, okay.
So this is in the telecine.
Right.
You would have your first control was really the light source.
Yeah.
So the equivalent of exposure was basically controlling the brightness of the lamp. Then, yes, you had lift, gamma, gain, and you had saturation.
Well, you probably had the gains of the three of the red, green, and blue pickups, and then
Yeah. So you had the sensors. You're right. You had 3 sensors. So that was one of the big differences between the CRT telecines and the CCD telecines. But they both had control of these sensors, the red, green, and blue, of those sensors.
Primary gain, yeah.
And they were very non-linear, honestly. They were somewhat hard to use. But of course, if you didn't get those correct, then you really had no chance of fixing it, down the line, because you'd be clipping or compressing it to a point that you couldn't fix later. So you had to get those right.
Yeah, think about how that affects our workflow now, because that's so ingrained in me that I've got to stretch the signal to as much as I can early so that I introduce less noise later, but obviously I can't clip it. So that logic is...
There's a window.
It's with us today.
Yeah, there's a window. Yeah, no, it's very much, it's the equivalent of camera raw now, but we didn't have color temperature controls. We had red, green, and blue.
Yeah.
And those were sensors, usually I think in both types of telecine, they were controlling filtration, really. So we had those. We had, as you say, saturation and hue, and then we had red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow secondaries, and those would have, initially they were just saturation, and then hue, and then later luminance. I'm not sure that luminance came until the digital desks. And then when the first Davinci came, so that was the first remote system, there were 2 things that were very cool about that, I remember. One was that because it was a standalone system, you could put a tape deck through it. And a lot of the work that we got was because nobody else could fix a problem that was on tape. If somebody was shot with a beta cam or something.
Grading. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was it had a window. Now, when I say it had a window, imagine this. It was a rectangle with no soft edges.
Brilliant.
Right? So the only thing that you could do inside that window would be secondaries, because otherwise you just see an edge around it.
Right.
So initially, it was only a secondary window. A secondary in this case, meaning red, green,
just pull
blue,
a key, man.
cyan,
Pull a
magenta,
key.
yellow. Well, yeah, and it wasn't strictly speaking a key either, because you didn't have any key adjustments at all.
Yeah, no, there was. I'm sure there wasn't the key. Yeah, exactly.
No, there's not a key. It was literally looking at secondary isolation, but it wasn't a key. It was affecting
built
frequencies.
Into the tool. Yeah.
But actually, I found out later it's really part of the matrix. I think it was a sort of the thing in those days is that the tools didn't come because colorists asked for them. The tools came for engineering reasons to get the picture off the film into video. So there were tools that were not particularly well labeled, and that was why you had to really kind of dig around in terms of what you could do with them rather than what they were designed to do.
What were we actually seeing there? I mean, the concept of cine on log, or that doesn't exist yet. That's not even on the radar yet, right? So it's literally,
no, in fact, you couldn't
light
really
going into a CCD. So it's how a video camera sees light coming through a piece of film and puts it on a 0.0 to 0.7 volt range.
Yes, and in the early days, we couldn't deal with negative or interpositive or anything like that. It was only prints in the early days.
Right.
That was a problem, because if we could, we would ask for low contrast prints. They were called TV prints.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because if you had a film print for a cinema, I mean, you couldn't get anything out of the shadows. And then slowly we started working with negatives, and so we needed new sets of tools. The first, of course, was being able to inverse the polarity of it to get a positive image out.
Yeah.
But yes, there was no log, although in fact, of course, in hindsight, the reason why negative works so well is because it is logarithmic.
Yep, but it's built in. Yeah, the roll-off top and bottom are built in, yeah.
So that was kind of where so that's where we kind of learned about working grading. We didn't know it as logarithmic. We just knew it as working with film negative. And I mean, in those days, you had, I've forgotten about, we call it the God monitor, but in those days, it was something that the BBC engineers had introduced in London. They would typically have a color monitor and a black and white monitor side by side. And I dare say that originally that came from the days when they were transmitting both. But the argument for that was that you had the black and white monitor as a reference. So because we didn't have any other way of, in the first days we didn't have any frame stores to white to either. That came a bit later as well. So I could do one of two things. I could either rewind the tape that I was recording to, but that was quite a hassle because you needed somebody in the machine room. And of course, as an assistant, you don't have an assistant in the machine room.
Right.
So there was that. But the other thing that you could do was you had these black and white monitor next to the color monitor, and you would use the black and white as your reference and to get an idea of where neutral was. And I was trained by engineers, so their idea of grading was you balance the blacks, balance the whites, fiddle around with the gammas, and you're done. That was kind of it. And it was mostly, it had to be correct on the waveform.
And so balancing meant balancing it to the black and white monitor. Is that what you're saying? The whites are white when they look the same on both monitors. Wow.
Because if you didn't do that and you sent it to the TV station, as they were lining up the tape, they would misalign it because they felt that there was something wrong with the tape.
Right.
So, we always had bars at the front, and we had to make sure that the program, if you didn't hit a peak, for example, if you didn't use peak white somewhere in the program,
they'd stretch it for you.
When it got to the TV, They would say, well, this is not right. It doesn't match the bars. We'll have to crank it up a bit.
Yep.
So we'd have to do things like put a token white in somewhere to stop them doing that. It was different. But yes, that was it. And I did that religiously until I guess I was grading about 5 or 6 years. I was in my sort of third company by then, and I had a client come in and say, we want to do this black and white video. It was it was a commercial. It was a black and white commercial. And it was only then when I made the color monitor black and white, I made the grade black and white and put it on the color monitor.
Yeah.
And the client said, why does the color monitor look different to the black and white monitor? And I said, oh, I'm very sorry. And I called an engineer, called the house engineer. And I said, why don't they match? These are supposed to be calibrated. And he said, well, of course they don't match. The phosphors are different between color and black and white. They can't match.
Jesus.
And I said, well, and we kind of got our way through it. I mean, actually, the commercial did very well and won lots of awards. It was based on an Ansel Adams theme. So it was beautiful. But I had them throw out the black and white monitor at that point. I said, actually, if we're going to do this, we'll need to have 2 color monitors and set one of the color monitors to black and white, because I can't have clients coming in and seeing that black and white doesn't match across the 2 displays. What sort of a reference is that?
Okay. So that's probably not something to comment on now. But what the hell is the spectral bandwidth of a black and white monitor? Is it emitting somewhere in the middle? It's probably somewhere in the middle, right? No, it's equal at all frequencies. I mean, what the hell would it be?
No, it'd be the white point is different. The white, it wouldn't have been D65, I imagine.
Yeah, it's only got one type of pixel.
Yes, but it's just if the white point is different, so the white point on the color would have been D65, but it was probably somewhat higher than that. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. Well,
but it was definitely very visibly different, and it freaked me out because I thought, well, all these years I've been balancing.
Everyone who knows the answer to that question is dead now.
No, I'm sure there are some color science people that know that, but it's pointless since we don't have those black and white displays anymore.
Right.
Well, we don't even have the color displays anymore, do we?
Okay, one last thing before we fast forward slightly. I just wanted to note that how you made titles in this age was the art director for a commercial made it on his computer, even drew it by hand or just constructed it, printed it out on a piece of paper, put it underneath the caption cam, and then the caption cam recorded that as video or keyed it live or something. So yeah, I mean, those were the days.
Yeah, but also we should point out that the role of Telecine, the role of the colorist in those days is very different to the role of the colorist today, because you could never finish in the grading suite.
Yep.
It was always, there were different workflows, but in every case, it went from grading to an editor, and the editor would always be finishing.
Right.
So that's a major difference with today, when in most cases, not all, but in most cases, the colorist is actually finishing.
Right.
And the fact that the colorist is finishing is more akin to the film workflow in a film lab.
Right.
Because in the film lab, the last touch is from the lab
Timer, yeah.
timer, they used to call it. Yeah. Because they would be working on the cut neg, and they would make the release prints and the answer prints, etc., etc. But in the video world where I was working, there was no way that we could finish anything. I mean, we couldn't do titles. We definitely didn't have caption cameras. We couldn't even conform.
Right.
That could only be done by an editing system. So it was a very different job in those days.
Linear tape edit suites. Yeah. I mean, I'm getting a good memory now of this issue of high-end commercials would, even when it was easy to grade negative, you had profiles, you had proper, like what I've got on my screen here, these Telecine analysis films. You had it for every single stock.
Correct.
It was still the upper echelon or like the high-end commercials, which would take an extra day, cut their neg, pull a low-con print, and then send that to the Telecine. Because the look was just better, Telecine couldn't create it. Let's let film take it even more of the way there with a low-con print. And then I remember that as kind of the deluxe version.
Well, indeed. And you knew that you had the job when they would bring in the cutting copy. So before you did that low-con print transfer, they would bring in a cut print because they were editing on film.
Right.
And they would bring in the cut print, and we would then run that through the Telecine for approval. Somebody said to me one day, don't make it look too good, because it's got to look better when we go back to the clean print that you're going to transfer later. And what they would do is they would lay down that cutting copy with all, sellotape joins, or sometimes it'd have cement joints, but often it was sellotape joins.
Right.
And you'd lay that off the tape. And then in the online, the final edit, they would start with that, and then they would insert over the top to match the cuts.
Yeah.
And they would always say, make it a little bit, I would normally do it a bit low saturation,
right,
so that they could tell the difference between the new and the old. But that was how we did approval copies in the days before tape editing.
You kind of were talking about Telecines being a bit of a side thing. I mean, later on I remember one of the bosses that I worked for, he said that Telecine is also always a loss leader. So it's going to cost you a hell of a lot every year. It's going to be a sink for money, but it gets clients in the door, and it's the hub around which a facility gets built. You lose money on the Telecine, but you make it back on the Flame, the audio suites, all the linear edit suites, and the tape room.
To be honest, most companies made the biggest profit on doing the dubs, on making the copies. Because remember, it wasn't like one master, one digital file that you can then copy and clone. To keep the quality up, because we were on analog tape generations, you had to make a dub for every TV station, for example, if it was a commercial, or every place that you were going to send this job, whether it's a music video or a feature film or whatever. They needed an original transfer from the Telecine, or they needed a first generation copy. And so they made a ton of money on the copies right at the end of the job. But you're right, Telecine was considered a loss leader. And what changed that, so that the big change was when I might bring a job in for grading, but the editing would go out of house. And then the facilities bosses had to rethink that whole way of working. And in fact, one of the jobs, I had my third job, I think it was. Yeah, my third job. So I would have been grading 5, going on 6 years by that time. And I was offered a job at Rush's. And it was a fantastic offer, because I met the managing director. So it was owned by Virgin in those days. And he said, I've been asked to see if we can get you here because you do a lot of music videos, and Virgin has a lot of musicians. He wants to know why we're not grading our own music videos. And we've asked all the clients, and the clients said, well, because we want Kevin to do the grading, and so we go to Kevin. Right. And so he offered me a nice job, and I said, well, what have you got? And he had a really old rank Mark III Telecine, which I wasn't very keen on working on, because I hadn't come from that background, so I didn't really know how to tweak it properly. Yeah. So that was one problem. But the other problem was that they already had a colorist there that was filling the suite up all the way through the day doing commercial work. So I said, when am I going to do my work? And he said, well, you'll have to do it at night, of course. And I said, but you don't understand. I can easily do 40 to 60 hours a week of billing music videos. I'm going to be working past midnight every night. He said, well, that's a great problem. He said, if you can do that for 3 months straight, I'll build you whatever suite you want.
Wow.
And that was the red flag.
Yeah.
And I did it. I mean, 3 months later, I went into him and I said, I think you'll find that I've billed at least that for every day over the last 3 months. How about this suite? And at that time, the Ursa Telecine, do you remember the Ursa?
Yeah.
So the Ursa Telecine was pretty new in those days.
Exhibit A. It's a 16
there
mil
you go.
gate.
There you go. Yeah.
Let's get the focus on that. Jump free.
Jump free. Yeah.
More advanced.
So that jump free was revolutionary, because what that meant was that we didn't need to use the steady gate anymore. It was stable enough to run it into visual effects, and by that time they could either stabilize it or it was good enough to work with.
Right.
So it was quite a revolutionary thing, but it was brand new. And we were very lucky in that the in-house engineer we had, was one of the original designers of the Ursa scanning system. And so he was very creative. He was very interested in kind of pushing the boundaries with this new machine. And coincidentally, I was already working with Davinci, and they had brought out the first digital desks, Renaissance. And at that time, there were almost none in London, because the analog machines had been so hard to maintain. Nobody was using Davinci in those days. But I was a Davinci user, and so I told him I wanted this Ursa and a digital Davinci system.
Right.
And the other colorist at the facility freaked out. He said, well, I won't be able to use that. That's going to be useless for commercials. And there was a big fuss, and I said, well, I'm going to walk. If you don't honor your agreement, I'm just going to walk. And I think within about 2 weeks of us opening that suite, the other guy came in and he said, this is not going to work, because that suite's so much better than my suite. I've got to have the same thing. And we built a mirror version for him immediately afterwards.
Big money.
But that was a big change. Well, it was a big change in the industry.
Yeah.
And I remember the debate. So the debate was, again, the managing director said, so wait a minute, you want me to buy this really expensive new Telecine, which means that a job that was taking 8 hours on Steadygate is now going to take an hour. Where's my profit?
Exactly.
And I said, trust me, because if you're the first one to do it, it will be easy to bill, 8 clients instead of 1 client. If you're the last one to do it, you'll have no clients left, because they'll all have gone somewhere else where they can do 8 hours work in an hour.
Yeah.
And so we did it. And that was a fantastic time. Well, it nearly wrecked me. I mean, that was a low point in my health.
Sure. Yeah.
But it was from a career point of view, it was fantastic.
Yeah. Didn't see the sun, I'm sure.
No. Well, worse than that, I had my first child was born around that time, and she was asleep when I got up, and she was asleep when I got home.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
So that plays on you a bit, and I ended up
pros and cons of the film industry, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just before we get more modern, I just wanted to go way back in a slightly different way. I'm just old enough to remember kids' parties. The parents would rent a 16mm projector, and they would rent the cans of film, and they would come and play it on the wall. You'd put a sheet up in the lounge, or you'd play it on the wall, and then you'd have to change the reels, and it was stuff. I got a list here like Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo. We watched that a lot. Cannonball Run was definitely in there. And then the South African vibe was Gods Must Be Crazy and another film called E Lollipop. If it wasn't those 4 films, then it wasn't a birthday party.
Oh, is this 16mm or 8mm?
16 mil. 16 mil.
Yeah.
I remember someone actually also... slightly later on, when a friend of my parents arrived with a videotape, they'd go, let's get a movie for the kids. So they got a videotape. We didn't have a player, and she just said to my parents, well, can't you just play it on the wall? This VHS tape in her hand.
Well, of course, the quality difference between VHS tape and a 60mm projector was enormous.
Right.
I mean, there's this belief in our industry that as time goes on, everything gets better. But that's not at all true. I mean, nitrate was better than safety film. And when people go back to sort of Victorian photography, I mean, they were using 10 by 8 negatives. I mean, beautiful, beautiful originals. Yeah. So we for a long time, we've actually been going backwards for the sake of convenience.
Right.
So, that adage is it easier, better, faster, cheaper? I think it's pretty much in that order.
Right.
And easier is what's driven the industry, not better.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we tend to focus a little bit more on better, but for a long time that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Well, think as another constraint. I guess it's the cheaper constraint, but in terms of energy limitations on monitors and things like that. Obviously, I mean,
Sure.
we're way above what's comfortable to view. So it's not like it's, you're trying to weld people's eyes with a monitor. So brightness isn't everything, but still, that's another thing which controls, what we end up seeing.
Well, particularly on set. So yes, I think it's a very valid point. Obviously, you've got to have some control over what happens in the home, given the number of television sets around the world. Mm. But another constraint is you're on set, you need to be running from a battery source. So you can't be having some really power hungry, bright HDR type monitor. It needs to be light and it needs to run from a battery. And we've only just started seeing that this year for HDR.
I was a bit taken back when I went to set, I think it was sometime this year. I said, "Wow, set's all Wi-Fi now. Everything's got antennas on it."
That's correct. Yeah. And again, that has compromises because a lot of those Wi-Fi units are 8 bits. And they're limited to HD. Yeah. And I think the Flanders, for a long time, the Flanders DM240 would have been, for me, the ultimate reference display on set because it was natively HD. And so it's very good for focus and things. But now it's pretty hard to find an HD display. I don't think the screen manufacturers make HD displays. I'm not really aware of one in commercial use.
You can't have one. You just have to use 4 pixels to equal 1 pixel.
Right, but reference monitors on set, they typically didn't have any scaling in them. So you put an HD signal on a 4K monitor and you start seeing aliasing because you've got 4 pixels instead of 1. Yeah. So now they're having to introduce scaling into these reference monitors, which they never did before.
Yeah, I think it's totally true what you're saying, that we think of it as, things are getting better like this, but there are these step changes, like step down and then slowly crawl back up and then step down.
Well, even in HDR, I mean, for a long time, HDR was promoted as a way of selling 4K televisions because the increased contrast made the picture look sharper and because the increased brightness gave you more colors, whereas actually having 4K pixels on a same size screen didn't really do very much from an audience point of view.
Well, just everyone move your chairs closer. Then you'll see the pixels.
That didn't really work. And the same with color, because everybody is sold, the sales pitch is 2020 gives you more colors. But of course, we know that none of the TVs do anything. You're lucky to get P3 out of them. You're definitely not going to get 2020 out of them.
Yeah.
So HDR was a way of enabling these kind of sales myths. But this year in Europe, anyway, we've seen that there's in live broadcasts for sports like football and Formula One and things.
Yeah.
There's a push back now to go to HD HDR, which initially nobody wanted to do, but because we need the bandwidth.
Yeah, and the HDR-ness gives you a more heightened feeling.
HDR is more bang for the buck. Yeah, you get a better picture with HDR than you do by just upscaling it to 4K, or not upscaling it to 4K, but delivering 4K. For most people, especially if they're watching on a phone or something, they're not going to see the difference.
Ignore sports and things like that, but just for creative films, I'd love to see a seesaw. On the left side of the seesaw, put pixels that actually fall outside of Rec 709. And on the right side of the seesaw, put ones that fall inside of the 709 gamut. And then
But things have changed, haven't they? Because now we know that if you look at pointers gamut, there's not a lot of colors in the real world that we need outside of 709.
Totally.
But what we do need is we need the brightness.
Yeah.
Because remember, and it's one of those things, right? It's one of the things that I've learned.
Yeah, we're going up.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've learned in my career is most of the time you can't learn something until you get to the next level. So I never saw 709 quite as limiting as I do now when I was working only in 709. But as soon as I worked in HDR, the first thing that struck me was not the brightness. It was the ability to go 100 nits or more in a single color. In 709, if
pure blue, yeah.
you, well, or even pure red, like on stoplights and things, because in 709, if you want a color to be bright, how do you make it bright? Well, maximum brightness out of a 709 display is maximum red, maximum green, maximum blue. So on a 10-bit scale, 1023, 1023, 1023. But when all the channels are equal, there is no color. You're basically
in the middle. Yeah.
You're neutral.
Yeah.
And so with particularly red and blue, as you say, if you want those colors to be brighter, you have to dilute the saturation by adding the other color channels in. Like I say, I never really thought of that as a problem in the past. But now that you can actually do 100, 200 nits of red, pure red, without adding any green and blue channel in, those are the colors that I think are most interesting. And that's got nothing to do with 2020 or P3.
Yeah.
That's only being able to go brighter in one channel than you can in the 709 system. And it's just because you've got that headroom. I mean, obviously, if you were working on a 10,000 nit screen, then you'd have the same problem. Or would you? Not really, because those are spectral highlights and you don't really care about color in something that's 10,000 nits.
Yeah, I think that's...
But for everyday grading, I think that's huge, particularly animation, for example.
Yeah.
And Disney were kind of early to play with it.
Yeah, I mean, the new tool comes along and then it takes time to... But my current feeling is that we actually... You need that peak for some things. You need that width in the gamut for some things, but it's almost like you're saving it most of the time. You don't show it most of the time, so that you can show it in the explosion scene or when something happens. So it's a very interesting waiting.
Yeah, well, I think that's true in terms of a general policy. But like I say, what strikes me as most interesting about HDR is you don't have the limitations of 709, and that it's not just 100 nits, but it's 100 nits of red or green or blue, which you don't have in 709. So if you think of 709, it's kind of like a cone, isn't it? That as you get brighter, the saturation reduces, and actually as you go down towards black, the saturation reduces as well. But in HDR, that's not the case, and you've now got that wider palette. But it's not a bigger color gamut, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you would call it a bigger color gamut, but it's not a bigger triangle, is what I mean.
Yeah, it's a taller tent. It's still a tent,
it's
but
the volume.
It's a way
exactly
taller.
Right.
Yeah. We have kind of discussed the commercials workflow, but I mean, just I remember the process of. I mean, do you think you could still laser telecine now?
I could. Oh God, yeah, I could definitely laser telecine.
It's in the blood, right? It's in the blood. You could do it.
Yeah, and when I was at the BBC. So I kind of built a facility for the BBC, and then they made me. I joined them as lead technologist, but then they made me head of restoration. So we had Scanity scanners.
Right.
That's just like it's just like a telecine, and so you lace those up, but you're going to file rather than going to videotape.
Were they the wet gate ones?
We didn't have the wet gate. We did that all in post.
Yeah, I've just recently visited the Taiwan Audiovisual Institute, and they basically got hundreds of films to do, and they do kind of 10 films a year. And they've got the, Scanity and the ARRI scanner, both with wet gates. I thought, ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of wet gate. I mean, it's horrible to use. That's all.
Yeah,
but,
poison,
big fan.
Right? Chemicals. Yeah.
And you can't help but get it on your hands because it has to leak.
Right.
Just the way it is. Kind of like Concorde taking off with all the fuel leaking out of it until it gets up to speed. It's It's just a leaking bucket.
Expands. Yeah. I mean, there's so many detours, but I think this one's worth taking. We kind of touched on it already, but our industry, as the people who make the stuff, we feel it's about the art and it's about technology, all those things. That's what gets us going. And but you chat to people who are on the marketing end of our industry, and what's important is to have a hook, a reason to re-release this film. And what I've encountered with these the crew at the Taiwan restoration unit is they're very into they've basically got the kind of ethos and the rule book about restoration. Like if it's from the 50s, you got to make it look like it's the 50s. You got to make it give people the viewing experience of the 50s. You don't want to, the worst case would be to take that and stretch it out into Rec 2020 and 1,000 nits. And so it's a very interesting thing.
There's a general acceptance that there's two types of restoration. One is where you're preserving it as it was when it was first made. And that means, for example, that if you had negative dirt and it was printed into the release print in the cinema, then you leave it there because that's how people would have experienced it.
Right.
The other is remastering, which is where you are trying to interpret that image for a new audience. And you have to accept that the audience aesthetic has changed. Right. And so then you will or can make changes that would be more appropriate to today's audience. And there are some really good examples of that. I've got a DVD disc, for example, or a set of discs of E.T.
Right.
And one is a restoration, a true restoration of the original film. And in the other one, Spielberg changed his mind about, he felt it was inappropriate for children to be seeing guns the way that they appear. And so he digitally removed all the guns and replaced them with walkie-talkies and things like that.
Wow. Because
he felt it was more appropriate in hindsight to do it that way. And equally, there are a number of companies in Los Angeles now that are restoring sort of film noir and Marilyn Monroe black and white movies in HDR. You can imagine the glitter balls and the sequins and the diamonds and things. That looks amazing in HDR.
Right.
Still black and white, but that is going to kind of allow you to resell this to a newer audience without that shock of, oh my God, it looks so old,
Right.
And I think there's a case for both. I feel that it's much more difficult to do the remastering if there's nobody left alive.
Right.
But if you can work with the director or the cinematographer, then very often they will say to you, well, this is what we really would have done. But it wasn't possible to do it in those days.
Yeah, these were our limitations, and we were trying for this, yeah.
And that's not a new thing, because I remember in the 90s, so in the 90s we had HD telecines, but we were still working with hardware which wasn't capable of cinema film resolution. And during the 90s, when we were doing HDR mastering of a movie from the cinema.
HD mastering, yeah.
HD mastering, very often a director... We didn't often get the cinematographer in the room for those, but the director would come in and he would say, yeah, don't worry about the cinema reference because we couldn't do the things that we can do in video in the film lab. And so sometimes the DVD version would be quite different from the cinema version because it reflected what the director wanted to do, particularly if he'd come from a television background and they felt limited by the film lab process. And that was a big
only printer lights
reason. Yeah, and that was a big reason for software color correction. The first software color corrector, Colossus was called then, later on became Luster eventually. That was designed to do film resolution for back to the cinema. And it was one of its selling points was that it doesn't do the things that video telecines do. It's a file-based system. In truth, it wasn't the first because Kodak had sort of proved the idea with their Cineon system. But of course, that was ridiculously expensive. And I think, was that one of the ones you had to... Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that the Cineon system was so expensive is I think that you had to sign into the development program because there were so few users. Every facility that bought Cineon had to pay into a development fund to kind of keep coming up with the new things that were needed.
Wow.
So it wasn't really commercially viable. And then, of course, Kodak made it more viable for themselves by introducing their own facilities, the CineSite facilities.
Right.
And that upset everybody else even more because they said, now you're competing with your own customers. That's not really a fair, you have a trading advantage. But eventually the software systems kind of gave us the promise of doing both and doing the same thing in video that we do in cinema and the same thing in cinema that we do in video. But that took a few years.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the example. I was created I didn't do the restoration part. I just did the color part of a 4K redo of a well-known film from the 2000s. And it's all about color and a very extreme color that you could not do with printer lights and you could not do it on set. And the reference that I was given was a Telecine Master. And I can just see how the picture was stretched. And we used to stretch the picture and damage the picture in those days. We used to crank. And I could just see how this it was kind of the upper mids or something. It was just torn apart. It was just a very bad reference. So yeah, I did my own thing and did a nice print emulation essentially on top of it. But it was so interesting to see that, yeah, at one time, and based on the tools that we had, that was considered fine for the TV/DVD release.
Well, in our defense, I would say it was more than just fine. It was necessary. I remember, because I used to teach at Kodak in the 90s as well, and they would do this sort of wonderful course where it was mainly for film lab technicians, to be honest, but they got more and more colorists on there because it was really the only way to learn about film from the science side of things. And I used to demonstrate the telecine, and there was in the early days there was a sort of an ongoing debate because Kodak instructors would always say that the only way to really see film is to do a rush print.
Optical projection, right?
And my argument was, yes. And my argument was, but actually, if you really want to see what's coming out of the camera, in other words, the negative, you can't do that with a print because a print eliminates so much of the dynamic range of the negative that you can't really tell what's on the negative from the print.
Yeah.
And I showed them, they had a vested investment in the early Spirit telecines because that was Kodak optics. And so I showed them on a telecine how you could really see how much shadow detail you'd captured and how much highlight detail you'd captured, really not at the same time, not without it looking very flat and horrible, what we now call log, but
yeah,
that was kind of early days. And they kind of revised their way of thinking, and they said, yeah, no, actually, if you want to analyze the negative, you can really only do that on a telecine. You can't do that with the print. What we didn't, the missing part was if I wanted the print look, which is really what they were trying to show, on the telecine, that was really hard because we didn't have any color science to speak of. We'd started really playing with film LUTs. And the purpose of those was that if we were going to go back to cinema, we had to grade it on a monitor, on a digital monitor, but we had to emulate what it would look like on projection. And to do that, you had to somehow bake in the process of recording it to a negative and then running it through the bath, making a print, running it through the bath, and then putting it up on a projector with a different color temperature. And you had to somehow emulate that. Well, obviously, we couldn't do that with just straight science. So what you do is you put a test film through, measure it, and then have an empirical LUT. And I mean, it was hugely expensive because no lab would share the LUT. And every lab would be using different chemicals, different print stocks. And so every lab would have to have a different LUT. And since they wouldn't share them, every job that we did that way had to go through this process of creating a LUT for that one job.
There's also the argument that the bath would change month to month, year to year. Hot season, cold season, it would drift a little bit.
Well, it would, yeah, a little bit, but it would be, the chemicals were replenished on the Monday. So, we always used to ask them to do it on the Monday bath. And if it was if you're doing a feature film and you're going to record out 5 or 6 rolls of film, well, it would take a day to record each roll because the film recorders are pretty slow. So you might get about 20 minutes out of a day. And in the early days, we suffered a lot of problems because they would make, a 20-minute roll, send it to the lab, and they might get that on Monday. And then the next day they'd get another roll. The next day they'd get another roll. But they only replenish the chemicals on Monday. So as you go through the week, the bath is changing quite significantly. Yeah. So we used to tell them, put it in the fridge and send all the rolls together and put them through one bath. Otherwise, we can't guarantee that they're correct. And we used to put lad tests on the front so that we could measure. There was a requirement for processing these films that the aim density had to be within a tolerance limit. Otherwise, it was the lab's responsibility, not ours. Because obviously, you can imagine how expensive it is to record out the film and then process it.
20 minutes of footage at a time, yeah.
Yeah, and even today, that workflow still exists because companies like CineLab here and Photochem in LA, they now do that same process, admittedly with a lot more science. They don't do the custom LUTs anymore.
Yeah.
But they do that process to put grain back onto the film,
Right.
and that's a very popular process. But that's expensive, and it's like, I don't know, it's at least £60,000 to run a film through that process. Looks great, I admit, but that's bigger budget than most of the jobs I do.
For my humble opinion, I think the best benefit is actually the MTF, the sharpness characteristics. Obviously, the grains there, fine, but the sharpness characteristics are the most hardest to recreate. And they've got the color science too good, I think. Part of the joy of film was the happy accidents, or the thing that you would never have done out of your own volition, but the process did it. It tinted it here or bent it there. So yeah, it's an interesting trade-off.
I wished I knew more then when we were doing that. I wished I knew more about the science, the color science part of it. But it was an exciting time. I mean, there's some great films done that way.
Sure. You obviously wanted to characterize the particular lab you were going to. There were a whole lot of other effects that, the crosstalk and all these things that you were actually modeling all in one step with this LUT. But from my memory is that the Davinci 888 and then the Davinci 2K, which was the state-of-the-art corrector, did not have an S-curve contrast control.
No.
Don't know if you remember. It didn't have it. So
well, that's not entirely true.
It had custom curves, which were terrible to control. That interface was just like slip here, slip there, and you couldn't zoom it up. But no S curve. What are you going to do?
No, there wasn't an S curve because we were using film as our lot. Basically, film was what gave us the S curve.
Yeah.
Both the negative and the print had the S curve. Yeah, and the print had its curve too.
Yeah.
So, and some people would want to go from the print for exactly that reason. So our color science was really analog in that sense.
Yeah.
And there was no need for the S curve.
Yeah. Okay. Just to maybe try and grasp a couple of the threads that I wanted to follow. Do you have any sense of these so-called scene referred or logged or wide gamut storage post-production spaces? We've mentioned one already, which is obviously the Cineon format, which is linked to Kodak, linked to film, linked to film outs, linked to DIs, all that kind of thing. But then my gut feel is that S-Log was a very early iteration of this wide dynamic range capture. I don't know if you have a sense of when that came in first, S-Log or the plain old S-Log. Presumably that was obviously in the TV world slightly more, I guess, but I guess that was Sony's offering, right?
That did come later, though.
Yeah.
That definitely came later because, of course, the early Sony cameras were broadcast cameras.
Yeah.
And a broadcast camera was essentially putting out gamma. They were definitely display referred. And I mean, I remember people telling me, I mean, all through my career, I've been grading 40 years now. And all through my career, people have been saying, there's no future in it. It's going to go away. Originally it was, the film is going to die and it's going to be gone. And then it was videotape, doesn't need color correcting. It comes correct out of the camera. Nowadays, AI is going to replace you all. So people have always seemed to have thought, but they're thinking about it from the science point of view. They're not thinking about it from the creative point of view.
Right.
But so Cineon was easy. So this is back in the late 80s, early 90s, when Kodak wanted to be able to do digital effects for film. This was how they were going to protect the future of film, was you could do digital effects and put it back on film. And it was a incredibly ambitious project. They had to build their own scanner. They had to build their own film recorder.
Right.
They had to build these tape machines that could record digital images and so on. And the first problem they had, of course, is that the tape machines could only move at a certain speed. And so they were limited to 10 bits.
Right.
And it was, how do you get the dynamic range of film onto a 10-bit, albeit digital tape? Right. They had some really clever people at Kodak. Remember, Kodak invented CCDs, and all the things that put them out of business were actually invented at Kodak.
Right.
But what they did was very, very simple. In the days of doing these film LUTs, the way that in the days of checking the chemical baths, actually, even before film LUTs, the days of checking the chemicals was you put a test strip through a 21-step grayscale, essentially.
Right.
And you measured the density of the red, green, and blue light path through the film, right? So
using a densitometer, right?
Using a densitometer. So it's just literally, you send a light through the film and then you measure how much light comes out the back end of it.
Yeah.
And you plot that in the red, green, and blue channels. And because color film is made up of three color layers, then they come out on the graph as separated. And when you plotted them, you got this S-curve, which was the response to light of the film to linear light from real life.
Yeah.
And they realized that if you just took those densitometer readings, you had solved your 10-bit problem. Because, think of a film negative. Well, a lot of people haven't seen a negative nowadays, I suppose. But a film negative is very, very flat. And it has a sort of an orange color to it.
Right.
And that orange color is the masking. It's a chemical mask because the red, green, and blue sensitivity is a little bit different to the red, green, and blue dyes that end up in the print. Now, you can't mask the print because otherwise you'd have like a color cast on the print.
Right.
So you double mask the negative. And that's what gives it that orange color. That's to get the colors, I won't say perfect.
Line it up for the print, yeah.
But it's to get the colors the way that Kodak want it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And different manufacturers had different formulas for how they wanted those colors.
Right.
But that plotting, that densitometer reading was the basis for, at least as far as I'm aware, was the basis of the Cineon logarithmic scan.
Right.
So it was based on actual Kodak film stocks. And then when the ACES project started, so the Academy started that around 2004, I think, about the same time that Digital Cinema Initiative happened. And the problem there was that films were getting trashed because they're really expensive and, they're bulky, but they also have to be humidity controlled and temperature controlled. And what was happening is people were trashing film, recording it running it on a telecine, making a 709 standard dynamic range master, getting a tape master of the film, and then throwing out the film.
Wow.
And, in my classes, I always describe it as going into the Louvre, taking the Mona Lisa off the walls, slapping it onto a photocopier,
right?
Andy Warhol style, and then binning the print, the painting,
the real deal.
So that was what was going on. So one of the reasons for the Academy ACES project was how the heck are we going to digitally preserve film forevermore for the future? They started off with the same premise that this idea of Cineon log would be a good way of preserving 10 bits. And the 10-bit limitation, of course, was only because we were still using videotape. Had we never gone through videotape, had we gone straight to file formats, I don't think anybody would have chosen 10 bits. It's not really a sort of a mathematical number. I mean, yes, storage would have been an issue, but actually speed wouldn't.
124816 is more in line with computers.
And we're only, 16-bit is, now it's becoming much more common, obviously, with the EXR format, and before that, to a certain extent, DPX. But even DPX, a lot of it was 10-bit log and not 16-bit linear. But anyway, they started off this idea of scanning and using Cineon log. And then when we went from broadcast cameras, so getting back to Sony, when we moved away from the idea of trying to be display referred and capture perfect 709 images, and we wanted more dynamic range, the camera manufacturers started to adopt this idea of a log format to give you the increased dynamic range over a gamma-based 709 image.
Right.
And it was funny. I mean, my first exposure to that was a camera called the Viper, Thompson Viper.
I remember that. Yeah.
And there was a bit of history behind that, and I learned about it first when I was at Davinci, because Davinci was talking to Kodak and Thompson to build a truly digital camera. And the idea at that time, the goal, was to take Kodak film science and magic source that into the camera so that you had a digital camera that looked like film, and it was going to have these kind of Davinci hooks into it so that Davinci would know exactly which film stock it should be, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Well, I forget exactly what the reasons were, but things fell apart. I don't know whether it was financial or philosophical or just the fact that we were talking about 3 companies in 3 different countries. But it fell apart, and Thompson went off and built the camera without the blessing of the other 2. And it was really, I think it was the first truly digital camera, and it had this extended dynamic range. And the way that they did it was they didn't limit the color channels. So the green channel was able to capture much more highlight detail, but it left the image coming out of the camera very, very green. And then you had to kind of LUT it to get back to natural colors, but you could do what we used to do with negatives. You could pull or soft clip or whatever you wanted to do. You could pull back that highlight detail. But what a lot of the cinematographers did is they said, oh, we haven't got time for all that digital stuff. And they would put a magenta filter over the front of the lens to get balanced pictures out.
Right.
Obviously not realizing or not caring, I'm not sure which it was, that if you did that, you just immediately gave up all the extra dynamic range because you just filtered it out,
right.
Which was kind of pointless because the camera had a broadcast setting on it where you could just say, capture 709 and it would spit that out for you. But that was the first digital camera. And I did a film in Australia on that camera. It won a lot of awards, actually. I mean, the cameraman did a brilliant job. And we were able to pull back these highlights in the forest and stuff. And it looked great. And that was very exciting. And it didn't really take off. The reason it didn't take off, I think, was mainly that there was no workflow for it. And the cameras that really took off gave you a post-production workflow. They made it easy for you to get it from the camera through post-production.
Panavision and Sony collab, what was it? Cine Alta or whatever.
Panavision, Sony, and then later Arri. So Sony were, you're right, Sony were quite early. And when they introduced their first digital cameras, the color gamut was based on the best that the sensor was capable of. And people struggled with it because it was not a good match to the display spaces that we were working, either cinema or television. And remember, it was the early Star Wars films where they started using these Sony cameras.
Yeah.
And so a lot of lessons were learned. But over time, they realized that unless you have a color management, which we didn't have at that time, it's all very well getting the best out of the sensor. But if it's impossible to get that into your display, it's a bit pointless. And it really messed up with skin tones and things. So they then came out with S-Gamut Cine, which was much more of a display referred space.
Right.
And it's interesting that they did that quite early because recently we've seen Arri do the same thing. And of course the Academy did it with, ACs between AP0 and AP1. That was a similar sort of change. So everybody kind of learned it.
Yeah, storage and grading, two separate. Yeah.
Yeah, so everybody learned that, but Sony were definitely the first to pick up on that.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, okay. I mean, for another little zigzag back into Telecine world. So what I find quite interesting, and probably people don't know, is that it was, we've said it's a live box, and the engineers, I don't know exactly the fine details on this, but basically the engineers said to me is that the Davinci 2K or the Davinci 888, which was the top end color corrector at the time, it only could ever have one line of video in it at one time.
That's correct. Yeah.
So it's very interesting. It also had no frame buffer. So you think, okay, no. I've got, firstly it's card by card. So there's a sync clock card. There's a maybe your line buffer card. There's your card doing your primer, and these are big, like. They look like they've been soldered by an enthusiast.
Yes.
It's a big printed card, which has been, got sent to someone, printed back, but then it's hand soldered components onto it, and all of that stuff. So all of that stuff with the mathematics behind lift, gamma, and gain, the 6 secondaries.
And this was really rocket science. We mustn't forget this was rocket science. There were export limitations on the 888 because nobody else in the world was processing 888. Even today, 444 is about as far as we go.
Yeah.
And the reason for 888 was that if you want good 444, because of Nyquist theory,
oversample that.
You need to be processing in 888. You need to oversample. But you're right. It was a pixel buffer really. And so that had very severe limitations, although at the time, of course, we weren't really aware of it. But the sort of things where you might do tracking, for example, you couldn't track anything because there was nothing to track. There was no picture.
It's gone. You're on line 2 now. Line 1's gone.
Yeah. I mean, it's so really they were they were very extravagant boxes to create LUTs. I mean, they work. Those hardware color grading systems work the same way that LUTs do. Yeah. We did have sophisticated windowing in the 2K. So the 2K did have a buffer in it.
Yeah, you buy it for £100,000 or whatever. You buy another card, you slide it in, and then boop, you get one more window. Which could
well, that was yes, that was right. In the 2K, you could add extra cards, but the big difference between the 888 and the 2K was that buffer. And there was a bit of there was an uncomfortable moment at Davinci because it was a 444 buffer, frame buffer, and we always promised that it was capable of 4K. Yeah. And one day somebody called us on it and said, we need to do 4K for cinema because they won't accept anything less. And the problem was that whilst we had a 4K frame buffer in there, the interface, the input interface, had no way to pass 4K images through it.
Right.
Because it was an SDI interface, and SDI in those days could not pass 4K through it.
Yeah, it was at best 3G or 1.5G or whatever.
It was before 3G. So yeah, there was just not, it was like, okay, we've looked at it. We'd like to give you a new input card or something like that, but it's just not going to happen. We can't deliver 4K in and out of the box. Interesting times. But like I say, we learned so much by having to squeeze lots and lots of requests out of a box with a pretty, by today's standards, a very limited tool set.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that there is maybe it's just philosophic, us looking back on our careers or some nonsense like that. But you definitely, your limitations obviously limit you, but they also, they're important because no playing field is limitless. So it's with how you work within those limitations. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It was Orson Welles. One of my favorite Orson Welles quotes is that art needs limitations.
Yeah.
And we definitely see that with some directors that, their best films are when they had limited budgets.
Right. Struggling artists.
Yeah. I mean, and you give them everything they want and it starts to become quite a little bit too introvert and sort of self-satisfying, really, I think. So, yeah, I think art does need limitations, but we still have, I'm not saying that we don't have limitations now. We do, and we still work around them. So it's just an increasing, but it's more difficult now. I think in those days it was much easier to learn color grading because you did have a limited tool set. And like I say, you had one new tool a year to explore for 12 months.
Right.
And then if you could convince your boss to spend another 50 grand, you might get another tool the next year, or if you could get the editors to give you a hand-me-down, whatever it was. I mean, I remember doing one job, a music video, where we were trying to do this very complex depth of field effect because the idea of the video was pulling focus and having these kind of beautiful out of shape people kind of across a white background things. And it was one of these late night jobs, and there was nobody else in the building. This was a huge facility in London at the time. And I wired the Telecine into 2 Davincis through a vision mixer. So I tied up 3 suites to achieve
3 times the blur. I remember the blur couldn't go very far.
Yeah, it wasn't just how far you could get the blur. It was how many different blurs you could get onto the picture.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then being able to mix it together, seamlessly, that was kind of beyond. This was on an 888, so not even a 2K.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah, we would do anything.
I remember having Bezier curve envy because I knew flame people could do it. And we were stuck with those either circular or square windows with very low soft edge. And it was just like moving it up the screen, moving it left, moving it bigger. And yeah, hard to control. So I did have Bezier envy for many years.
Indeed, yes. That was a big change. Having, what I call the graphics tools in the grading suite. That was a big software thing.
The one thing that because you were talking about it now, that, the looks, the inspiration or what the target we were heading for is pretty much around this time, the industry reference, especially for commercials, and I guess it leaked over into feature films as well, was the shots reels. It was a VHS tape which got sent to you once a month of the latest, greatest commercials from around the world. And my general feeling of it is that maybe because of the tools, maybe because of the nature of things, is we graded a lot heavier, tastes were a lot heavier, you push things harder, and compared to nowadays, things are a lot more rolled off and smooth. Just to give you one specific example, people used to comp in skies on shots, and the skies were made in a water tank that had paint poured into it, and the shot from below to look like clouds in slow motion, and that was comped in as clouds into the shots, which it looked like the apocalypse basically. And then that was cool if you had a car commercial or whatever. So I mean, how do you feel about that, the tastes, how that has changed?
So I kind of have a theory, I guess, about that, and that is that tastes come in cycles, and it's quite a predictable cycle actually. So, if you imagine that you're back in the days of black and white TV, and then suddenly you have color to play with, then of course you're going to exploit wild and vivid colors because you never could do that before. And it used to happen in visual effects as well. So I remember that when there was a device that could do page turns and things, back in the 80s, and then suddenly every ident on TV was page turns. And then you got, and it could turn it could take the picture and roll it up into a
clock wipes. Woo-hoo.
Yeah, but a picture could roll up into a cup or something. And so everybody did that because that was kind of new. And then when, you might remember when morphs came in, everybody wanted to, after that Michael Jackson video, everybody wanted to do morphs. So things kind of happen like that in color grading. So you go from black and white, then you've got your color, and then all that vivid color is kind of gets on your nerves a bit. So you back it off a little bit, but you might boost one color. You might have individual colors that, particularly if they had a relevance to a product or to the story or whatever. So you would use individual colors, and then contrast would change. And that whole, you can imagine how a few years ago, that idea of that low contrast log look was very popular, which from a painting artistic point of view is just a nonsense. I mean, that would never stand the test of time. But you've got to imagine that we went from video type grading with very limited dynamic range to log type grading where you had more dynamic range. And so, of course, all the cinematographers were saying, look, I preserved all these highlights. I want you to roll them back into the image. And so you were continually trying to bring these highlights down and bring the shadow detail up and control the contrast, because you couldn't do that before. So it was something nobody had really seen before. And then, you had, well, how do you make these low contrast, logarithmic looking images interesting? Well, you've really got to play with color bias. You've got to have color casts, and you've got the matrix green or the horror movie blue or the a bit later that sort of film blockbuster look, the orange and teal thing, or other colors. So all of these things kind of come through the palette, and in my opinion now we're about due for a reaction against this, as you say, very heavy grading that we've been through the last 10-20 years. And HDR has given us the way of doing that, because now you can preserve the highlights and have contrast, and you don't have to push that heavy. You can get these very natural, realistic looking images and still have them emotional, still have them very moving images without doing the heavy grading. So I think we are due, and we can expect a return to more natural, less obvious color grading. And I think that is strengthened by modern color science, where nowadays, I don't know how many people are doing this, but in my world now, I work for an on-set company part of the time. So my job with that company is to encourage a dialogue between the finishing colorist and the cinematographer pre-shooting.
Right.
And so that gives us an enormous amount of control, and everybody knows what it's going to look like from the moment they do their first take. And that, I think, we're not seeing as much of that on the screen as we could and should do. That'll be the next phase coming through, I think.
Yeah, I mean, here for tests. I mean, in the Telecine days, you definitely had the contrast curve built into the neg, which was scanned, and but pretty much, I remember lots. It was quite typical to just take whites up to and almost clip them on white and clip, on the black. And then it kind of came in later. The only thing you could do was the soft clip controls on the Davinci, but it was very different to our standard starting point of standard color management with the full 10,000 nit dynamic range, softly rolled. I guess it starts somewhere around 70 nits, all the way up to 10,000 is smoothly rolled all the way into 100 nits. So, I mean, just for you look at the new Log C4 test chart, the white patch and the white shirt are sitting at like 70%. But you just go back a couple of years to the instructions on how to line up a color checker. White's at 90, gray's at 50, and maybe the gray's at 50, but we're under this big soft roll-off.
But it's under our control. The thing is that in the days that you're talking about, it was all display referred. So we had gamma, that was how you mess with the midtones. And we, on the Davinci side at least, we always had these custom curves. People forget how pioneering we really were. Custom curves were designed by Davinci before Adobe Photoshop was even started. And it was, and the first times I used custom curves, I remember going to Davinci and saying, how the heck do I use these? They're really cool, but how on earth am I supposed to use them?
Yeah.
And what are they for?
Yeah.
And they said, well, actually, that's an engineering tool. That's how we test new features. We build them in the custom curves and try them out. And then if we like them, we turn them into a tool. And because the first time I used custom curves, there was no graphic interface. You just had these knobs. And I kept saying, what on earth am I adjusting? And you basically had two controls. One was a horizontal control and the other was a vertical control. So the horizontal control put the point where you wanted it on the tone curve. And the vertical control was, well, do you want a slow tangent or a steep tangent, where you could build that. And then once I'd understood that, I became passionate about custom curves because it didn't allow you to create your own tone mapping. Although, of course, I had no idea about the concept of tone mapping in those days.
Yeah.
But you could build any tool that you wanted. And I learned that because the engineers said to me, this is how we test new tools. We build them in the curves first.
Yeah.
And then we see if they work, and then we put an interface on it and we give it to people. And so that was huge, and that we had that very early on. Not many people were using it because
very hard to control. You didn't know what the hell.
It wasn't documented. Yeah, you did. Yeah. But once you got the hang of it, it was amazing.
Oh, okay. Point of order. You said the word documented. Can I just make a note here? A point of evidence to say that the manuals, the user manuals for all these boxes that we're talking about are basically a folder that you can go and buy at a stationery store, hand punched, printed notes, put into that folder, and then here you go. Read this.
Well, I can tell you, because for the 2K, I didn't write, well, I updated some of the Davinci 888 documentation, but for the 2K, I did all the documentation in terms of the user manual. And I had this idea that, as you say, it was a book that wasn't very useful to colorists because it was really hard to find the thing that you wanted. I mean, not a long way from the Blackmagic manual today. So I had the idea of writing it in HTML.
Right.
And so it was an interactive manual, and you would just, if it said to you, for example, adjust the custom curve, and you clicked on custom curve, it would take you to a page that told you how to adjust the custom curve.
Right.
And I spent a couple of years writing this manual. It was huge. And because every time I did something, or every time I got a phone call from somebody saying, how do you do this? I put it into this HTML document. And then the president of the company came to me and he said, all the engineers are complaining because when they buy a piece of kit this expensive, they want a manual to put on the shelf. And your HTML, it's a non-linear document. How on earth are we going to print it? And so I had to sit down with the PR guy, and we had to rewrite the manual in a Word doc. He had experience writing in these kind of complicated Word docs with indexes and things.
Yeah.
And we had to rewrite it because we were HTML was before it was too advanced for the. That's the way I like to think of it anyway. Was too advanced for the time, and they wanted something they could put on a shelf.
Just browse it on your computer. I mean, come on.
Well, no, it wasn't. Remember, this is kind of around the time of 2000, so computers were still a long way from where they are today.
Just another little exhibit here that I have. It's not a can of tuna. It's a TAF.
Is that TAF? Yeah.
TAF, yeah. For
my
each
best
of the
friend.
stocks. So yeah, I mean, that was basically the only way that you could have some like grounding to prove to the client, or have some stake in the sand to say, yeah, you did actually overexpose, or you did actually do. That was the only reference, right? We lined up to that TAF.
They wouldn't accept it. They wouldn't accept it. So there's two things that we should say about this. First of all, is that in a telecine environment, there is no reset.
No undo.
Well, not just no undo, but you can't just set all the dials to 0 and say that's how it should look, because you're talking about analog light going through the film, and the film is also analog and very variable. So that was the big problem. And cinematographers used to say, why do you call it color correction? There was nothing wrong with what we shot. Why do you have to color correct it? And the answer to that question is, we don't have to correct it because of what you did. We have to correct it because what you did is designed to go to a print, and we're not going to a print. We're skipping the print process, and we're going to video, which has very different, for one thing, much more limited gamut and much more limited tonal range. Yep. So we have to correct it for video. It's not a reflection of the cinematography. And so they would inevitably say, well, that's not what I shot, especially if they had a film background and they were used to seeing film prints. Because as you said, we couldn't do those roll-offs, those nice roll-offs that you got on a film print. And so for a long time, that was the problem. That was the kind of the distrust of the telecine, was that, well, how do I know what you've done and from what I've done? And Kodak did introduce a scheme. I'm trying to think when that was. That would have been in around 2005, 2006, I think. They introduced a box, and this box had it was based on Cineon, really, and they had all the film stocks built into it. And you had a test film that they provided, which was a sort of an extended version of TAF. You had to put the test film up and get readings on your waveforms and scopes that matched their targets. And then without touching the telecine controls, that went through this box. And then you could choose, it was basically a LUT box, you could choose which stock you wanted it to look like. And they tried it out in Hollywood for quite a while. You could buy the box in Hollywood. They never released it anywhere else in the world because they were paranoid.
Yeah, the secret sauce.
That people would take a digibeta and make it look like film. And so they pulled it off the market. But unfortunately, they killed the golden goose, because that was the only way that you could say the telecine is set up to neutral. You actually had to calibrate it to neutral. You couldn't just reset all the dials. And so that was a problem. And now, really the Academy solved that with ACES, so that with ACES, there is now a standard starting point for a digital camera. And to a certain extent, film, that there is a problem with film in that, unfortunately, there's very, very few scanners in the world that can do true ADX scans. But certainly from digital, we do now have a known starting point, so that as a colorist, I can say your film is perhaps exposed more than I would have liked if I want to preserve the highlights, or your film is preserved less than I would like, and it's going to create a certain amount of noise. But we could never do that. And so there was these sort of discussions about, well, is there a problem with your telecine, or is there a problem with my film, or is it a problem, with the colorist, or, where is the problem? Yeah. Because nobody knew what it was supposed to look like. They knew what they wanted it to look like, but it was, who's dropped the ball here?
Yeah, many links in the chain. Yeah, I guess it's a sign of the slightly older school colorist, if they're doing a lot of the work with lift gamma gain, and they don't really like jumping over to the HDR tools and that, because that really was the the workhorse that we used to do everything. It was the one hammer that we had, so we kept using it.
Yeah, but I mean, lift gamma gain would be useless if you didn't set the Telecine sensors, the PECs on this Intel, and I forget what we used to call them on the CCD machines. But it was a set of RGB exposure controls.
Yeah.
And if those were set wrong, there was nothing you could do to get it back with lift gamma gain downstream.
Yeah, it wouldn't track.
No, and there'd be clipping that wasn't clipping on the film. It was because you hadn't set the Telecine up. And the trick was, I mean, we all learned this. The trick was basically to set the Telecine not to give you 709 out of the Telecine, but to give you this sort of logarithmic flatness out of the Telecine, because if it, just like a camera, if it's not coming out of the Telecine, you can't fix it in your grading system.
Right.
So that was a very powerful lesson that we learned, that you've got to get the Telecine right first. And I think maybe that's lost a little bit today, where people sort of, again, in my classes, I always tell people, be very careful about jumping too early into, say, secondaries and windows and things like that.
Right.
Because it may well be that a simple primary change is all that you really need. And you could do 6 different secondary changes when you just got it wrong in the primary settings.
Yeah, I do feel that, obviously with, Omniscope and all these tools that are coming in, I do feel that there is a degree of visualization of the signal and the signal at different stages that we lack. I mean, just to reflect to Telecines, we used to have one parade scope up on the actual Telecine itself. So you'd put the film on, you'd actually have to focus the gate every time to check that it was in focus. And then you could, without the controls were back in the room, but you could see the RGB parade. And then we definitely had 2 stages of RGB parades in front of us. We had final room output and we had early, just out of the Telecine.
Yes, that's right. You had sampling from the Telecine, you had sampling from the light path, so it's as it's going digital, and then you had another sampling point as it comes out of the Telecine, and then of course you would have your third sampling point as it comes out of the color corrector. And you would know that the signal has to be flat and get more contrast as it comes through those 3 processes. And if you could see it clipping in, say, process 2, then you know that you can't fix that in process 3. You've got to go back in and do that earlier in the pipeline. And I agree that all of these systems now, they tend to monitor kind of from the display point of view, not out of, say, you almost want one after the IDT and a color managed workflow.
Yeah, because I think a big thing now for us is the integrity of the entire little, like potato, the little nice little package that is your signal. It's the little dents and bumps that are what we're very sensitive to now. And so it would be nice to be able to throw it up in a set of VR glasses or something and be able to spin it round and see where the kinks are.
Yeah, I mean, I come at it from a slightly different point of view. And I've been using ACEs now for over 10 years. And so generally when I'm grading now, and this is why I'm a big fan of HDR as well. So when I'm grading in my head, I'm grading in that scene referred HDR space. Even if it's going to an SDR screen, in my head, I'm grading it in HDR. And so I'm constantly aware of what's happening in that final tone map and what's happening in my grading, which is not that dissimilar from understanding what's happening to the negative and how is that changing on the print.
Right.
So from a photographic point of view, that kind of makes a lot of sense to me. Over the last couple of years, I've done a number of jobs where they only wanted an SDR master. On occasions, I've said, let's start grading in HDR and then we'll switch it over to SDR, just so that you can see what we have to play with. And in a couple of those jobs, we've gone ahead and, we finished the grading, obviously, on an SDR monitor because that's what they want. But in a couple of those jobs, I've said, after I've got approval, you always have to sign off and get approval before you do this. But after we've got approval on the SDR, I'll say, let's just flip the output transform over and have a look at it in HDR.
Right.
And it's 90% perfect. And they're like, oh, can we have that as well? And I say, knock yourself out. I mean, it's just one more export. It's not really a big deal. I would say if you're actually going to deliver it, I'd rather, have a bit more time to finesse it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the way I think now. So I think that's the bit that people often miss in HDR grading and in color managed grading, is that scene referred grading means that you're manipulating the source image as if you're doing it in camera and then relying on the output transform to get you onto a display. You're not trying to grade the display right without, and because the other way of doing it would be you grade it. The way that we used to do it is that you would grade it to fit the display and not rely on an output transform. Of course, in the commercial workflow, we don't even have an output transform.
Yep.
So that was quite a big change for me, because I grew up with grading it to look correct on a display. But now that's not what I'm doing. Now I'm kind of thinking more like a cinematographer about what's that. And the reason I do it is because I think of that as the archival master.
Right.
What Netflix used to call the graded archival master.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a huge benefit to have that. I don't for 1 minute think that will give you all of your display outputs. I think that you definitely do need to make trims.
Yeah, I've never experienced a just flick it and be happy. I'm always pushing it down.
Yeah, and that's fine. But I think of it as an archival master, and I feel that gives you a degree of subtlety that I like. Now, it's maybe not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
But that's how I like to work now.
Where do you sit on this feeling of obviously it's the whole dilemma of the ACES project. On one level you want to satisfy people with having a plug and play solution, and you end up saying, well, my current feeling is that I can't see the difference between totally technical transforms and totally creative transforms. And obviously, in the standard ACES model, there's an RRT, which is some kind of generic codec print lat, but then also we're doing technical transforms and they get blobbed together. So this like standardized color workflow and how much it becomes a prescribed creative workflow versus just some technical transforms to help you route through different color spaces. How do you fall on that predicament? And there's no.
I come down on the side of Steve Yedlin.
Okay.
So for those that don't know Steve Yedlin, definitely worth visiting his website.
Totally.
And he very early on was asked as a DP with a huge amount of film experience, shooting on film, and then he was asked to work on some digital projects. I think Star Wars were the early ones, and he said, I'd never worked with digital cameras, so I started asking people, how do you do this and how do you do that? And he said, when I thought about what they were telling me, it couldn't be true because it would never work. So he went back to test the cameras to see how he should use them, how he should expose them, and his only reference was really the film experience that he had. And so he produced this wonderful test where he came up with a color pipeline and was able to process ARRI footage, ARRI log C3 footage, so that it looked like film. And he puts it side by side and he mixes it up so you don't know which is which. And as he says, the point is not to make it look exactly like film. The point is to convince an audience that it could have been shot on film and for them to not know the difference between. Anyway, so where do I come on that kind of technical and science process against the creative? Well, he says that, as a cinematographer, you should not choose the camera to create the look. It's how you process it that creates the look. And It doesn't matter if you know what you're doing, it doesn't matter whether it's
ideally the camera is transparent,
an ARRI or a Sony or a Red, So from the colorist, the colorist equivalent of that is that the color science doesn't make the look. So people that say, "Oh, I really like ARRI color science, I like that look." Well, no, you don't like the ARRI look. That's you not doing your job. Now that. There has been an argument for some time that the Academy RRT, as you say, that's based, they've never admitted it, but let's agree amongst ourselves that it has a film print type look. Yeah. Because after all, ACES was partly to preserve film, so it would have that look. But in ACES 2.0, there is essentially a way of reversing the RRT with an LMT in front of it. So you put this transform in front of it, that will give you a perfectly neutral, I wouldn't say perfectly neutral, but a more neutral starting point So you can build your own tone map on top of it. And I think that's great, but I never really saw it as a problem. Like you said, it's one of those limitations that improves the art. I think a lot of people are going to struggle with the idea of the LMT canceling out the RRT, because now they are going to have to jump through hoops to create that tone, that S curve that we started off talking about, and which is so wonderful in kind of tone mapping from a wide dynamic range to a small dynamic range. If you have to produce that tone curve, it's not that easy. You don't really want a completely free rein there. You want something that is aesthetically pleasing, and then you want to shape it. But to do it from scratch is quite a lot of extra work. I'm all for using science if it saves time and gets me to where I want to go quicker.
Yeah, as a side note, on that film where I ended up building my own film emulation, the restoration film, the area where I could really tell if my 1D curve was not smooth was in those shadow, like from the cheek highlight going down to the roll off to the darker side of the face.
Yeah.
Always in the skin tone. That's where I could see if it wasn't smooth.
And when I'm setting up the pivot point on the contrast control in Resolve, that's exactly that's always my favorite sort of test point.
Split the face in half, the dark and the light side of the face.
Yeah, exactly that. And if the dark side of the face is getting lighter, then the pivot point is in the wrong place. And if the highlights on the skin tone are getting darker, then the pivot point is in the wrong place. I may still want to tone map the highlights down a little bit, soften them off and get rid of the shiny skin. But in terms of setting up the contrast, that's my rule of thumb, is look at a skin tone, because skin tones nearly always have highlights and shadows, and get the pivot point to recognize that. And then the rest of it's all in the contrast. But so I'm, in my job at Mission, we favor ACES mainly because it's open source. Everybody's going to have the same color science. We don't have to kind of jump through hoops sharing input transforms and things. And secondly, because there are input transforms into ACES color science. If you're working with ARRI LUTs or Sony LUTs or any other LUTs, of course, they're never going to give you input transforms to get somebody else's camera into their working space. So then you're opening yourself up to a world of pain in creating a repeatable workflow.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, just on the Telecine side of things, I mean, it's a really silly question. I don't know, because you maybe had some exposure to some of the engineering and what was going on inside of Davinci. My sense of the 6 vectors was that hue and sat were fine. We could bend those. We could work those hard. But the luminance control you couldn't touch it. You'd break the signal so quickly. So I'm curious as to what we were actually working in. I guess in YUV, right?
YUV, yeah. And you're just breaking the picture a little bit. And it's interesting now with the Resolve Splice tool, and there were some CTLs and DCTLs that were doing this before. I mean, if you were doing true film emulation, the one thing that we could not really do was density in the secondary vectors.
Right.
And there have been some tools which actually have been lost along the way, like a color replacement tool, for example, that we had in the 2K, and Pandora had it in the Poggle, that I don't think we really have now. But yes, it was just too much, because you're working in a color space, as you say, YUV, where luminance was most of the signal.
Right.
And then to try and stretch that using, subsampling basically, not subsampling, but not enough sampling basically. We just didn't have, because in YUV you're essentially 4:2:2 in terms of sampling ratios. So to take the 2:2 and try to apply that to the reason why you have the 4 part is because if you don't have 4 in that part, it starts banding and breaking up.
Yeah.
And so when you start trying to take the 2:2 information and applying it to luminance, that's what happens. It just kind of breaks up. So yes, that was always challenging. And I remember in the days of the 888 and the 2K, when we were doing trade shows and people would say, well, how do I know that this is better than what I had before? That would always be the go-to, is to look at the luminance in the secondary sampling,
right,
and see how much you could adjust luminance before it just got really, really noisy. And of course, we used it creatively. Like if somebody said, can you make this look nice and grainy? I would often use a luminance tool to create grain.
I'll tear it apart for you.
Yeah, easy to break it.
Yeah. Can you think of any other really unconventional telecine methods. Oh, exhibit number 3. This wasn't such a nice one because these are plastic, they're not glass. But the Spirit had this filter set. I don't know if you remember these, Promists, and they they'd also, just like black Promist, white Promists of various strengths. I think these ones are clear that you could put stockings on or whatever. And the one that we always used to use on the rank was cling wrap. Basically cover that mirror below the gate, put a cling wrap over there.
That was a slightly different, I mean, the result was different. But yes, in the early days, I mean, I didn't have that particular filter set, but I bought a whole load of, what were they, 4x4 camera filters.
Yeah.
And we had them, because later they modified the gate, but we used to have to go into the back of the machine and put them in. And so in the CCD telecines, you were diffusing the light source, which created a sort of a scatter effect that was quite beautiful, actually. Right. And we had, I remember, going to my boss and saying, I want to spend about 800 quid on camera filters, and we'll try them all out. And we had, like you say, Promists, but all sorts of other things. So that was quite good. But the other type of telecine, the CRT telecines, that was a spot being used to scan the film. So you weren't scanning a line or later a field. You were scanning a spot, kind of reversing out the display. And so you could create some quite unique effects there by sending this spot through colored layers and things. So we'd get sweet wrappers. I remember doing one job where they'd shot it on 16mm, but they wanted it to look more like home movie Super 8. And the thing about Super 8 film was at the end of every roll, you'd get these kind of light streaks as the, where the end of the film would be sort of still in the gate as you opened it up and changed the film, because it was on cassette base. Yeah. And he said, is there any way to recreate that? And I said, there is, and you can do it because I can't program it. And I got a bit of wire and we got a little bit of card, and I sat him on a chair in the machine room in front of the telecine, and I opened up the gate, and I said, every time you poke that in, it's going to create a light flare, because you're going to block the scan. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's probably one of the most lucrative jobs from the facility point of view. We graded the whole job in a couple of hours probably, and then I had it all programmed. And so he then sat there and we transferred the whole thing again with him just poking this bit of wire in and out of the gate. I gave him a little monitor so he could see where the picture was. Yeah. And he just kind of flared it creatively. Play mode, yeah. Brilliant. Play mode, yeah. Yeah. And I had a cup of tea in the other room. And so we did things like that. We used to swap the color channels over. I remember when Aviator was being made, we were asked, there was a colorist in Canada doing the dailies, and he had been challenged to create this 2-strip film effect, Technicolor 2-strip effect. And, this was still in the hardware days, and we had no way of doing it. And they gave us a reference out of Adobe After Effects where they literally just kind of pulled out one of the color channels and then created extended the color channels. And we couldn't do this with the existing tools. And the colorist said, what am I going to do? This is what they want. And I said, well, let's think about it, because the limitation of what they did in After Effects is that the blue channel goes missing basically in 2-strip. It's just red and green. And of course, with Aviator, that's a bit of a problem because you've got all these blue skies. What's going to happen to the blue skies? Well, in the Technicolor, so we did quite a lot of research, and in the Technicolor process, it is true that there was no blue channel, but the reds went all the way around to magenta, and the greens went all the way around to cyan. So there's actually only a very narrow slice missing. Right, so we didn't really want to lose the blue channel. Yeah. And we spent a couple of weeks, and we came up with this was on a 2K plus, and we came up with if you had like 3 extra channels in your power tiers, then we came up with a really good looking Technicolor 2-strip effect. But we were out of time, and it looked different to the tests that they had given to Scorsese. And so they said, no, it looks different. And I said, yeah, but it's, it looks so much nicer and it's so much more accurate, because we were actually using a proper matrix rather than just like killing the channels.
Yeah.
And they refused to present it to him. And so they went with After Effects. And in my opinion, that film, the color grading on that film is not what it should be. We were talking about restoration before.
Yeah.
And I don't believe a color film on 2-strip would have looked the way that film does. I understand that from a theoretical point of view, it's trying to do something similar, but it could have been much prettier. We could have kind of worked within those limitations and made it look much nicer. But yeah, I mean, we really had to re-engineer, and it wasn't something we could do in the color corrector alone. It had to be messing up the telecine and then fixing it in the color corrector to get this result. And it never got used, which is a shame, and that often happens. I'm sure today people come up with these beautiful LUTs that just never get used because it's not exactly what they were looking for on this job.
On the day,
and it's always very hard to sell something that you've created. I remember doing a film in Germany, for example, and the guy said, so we've got this dream sequence coming up, and I'd like to do something different. And I said, I've got just the thing. And looking back on it, it was an error in judgment. But I said, I've got just the thing. And I hit a power grade, and I said, this would be perfect. And he said, no, I don't want anything that's instant off the shelf. It's just got to be something new. And I said, but I've invented this. Nobody's ever done this before.
Yeah.
No, we're going to start from the beginning and we go through the process. So sometimes people just,
got to climb the mountain yourself. No helicopters to the top.
Yeah. Sometimes they don't want the best. They just want to do it themselves. And other times they don't care how you get there, and that can work against you as well. They'd rather have a sort of Instagram filter rather than you polish it and make it work for the particular project. And I think colorists have always said that 80% of the job is psychology. Actually, I don't ever want to believe that, but I think it depends on which market you're in, but particularly if you're working at a facility, that's probably true. Yeah. As a freelancer, I think that's not true, but there are cases where that's true.
Well, that terrible thing where colorists say, the client thought I made a change and I hadn't even made it yet, and he said, oh yeah, that's fine now. The thing is that if you turn off I've realized that my technique is a lot about my hands reach out and I start to touch the controls and I start moving, and my little feedback loop to myself as to like, am I on the right control? Or is it reacting in the right ways? If I can see the scopes moving, a little wiggle on the scope, and then I'm fine. So if you turn off the scopes, I feel like that client. I feel like, what, did it change? What? There's that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's
well, the placebo effect, yeah. And for a long time, you're right. For a long time, there would be controls on the panels, for example, that didn't do anything. Depending on which menu is up, some of them don't do anything. And so, yes, you could go and, on one occasion, I'd ask a client, like, just turn that as much as you like and tell me when you like it, sort of thing.
Right.
And you lose all trust in the client. And I got quite, I guess, really quite upset about it at one point, where, it seemed quite common that you could reach over to touch a control, and before you even got there, they'd say, "Yep, that's enough. Don't do any more."
Yeah.
And so I really had this sort of mistrust and this sort of condescension about clients for a long time. But later, when I was teaching kind of more about color theory, I realized that actually there is something more to it than just a placebo effect. And it's to do with your eye adjusting.
Right.
So sometimes the way to fix that problem, where they think, oh, like the white is too blue, for example. And what you need to do is reset their sense of sight, because everything that we see is so relative. Yeah. And it's not absolute. And sometimes you just need to reset.
Dynamically regulating, yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that's more what it is. And I think I give the clients the benefit of the doubt. Yes, there are going to be some that just want you to make a change, but actually they don't want you to make a change. But I think more of it is they have lost sight of their reference.
Right.
And the way back is to actually give them a point of reference. And I have 3 or 4 tricks that I like to use to do that. And then everybody feels better. They see that I've accommodated what they thought was wrong, but really it wasn't wrong. And
you've kept the boat stable. The look is still
I've
going
kept the
in one
boat
direction.
stable.
Yeah, it's not.
But also equally important, I've checked my own vision and made sure that actually it's not me that's not seeing it. And they've seen something. Obviously, the picture hasn't changed. That's not what we're talking about. But what we're talking about is the what I now like to call organic intelligence. We hear all about AI,
right.
but the OI is actually more important.
Yeah.
And our sense of sight is relative. And so we need to fix that point of reference. And of course, that's what calibration of the display, but also calibration of the workflow is all about.
Yeah.
And so we need to sometimes check that. And I have a policy too on difficult scenes that you need a timeout.
Right.
So if I'm working on a feature film, for example, between 20 and 30 minutes, that would be the maximum I'd spend on a scene at any one time. And I would say, we've got to get through this much by the end of the day. Let's go on and do some more of the other stuff, and we'll come back to it. And very often, especially if you say, let's come back to it, tomorrow morning, very often what happens is they come back to it and they'll say, oh, what did you do? That looks so much better now.
Right.
Or even you just play out of the previous scene and into the next scene.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, yeah, that's working.
Yeah.
And all that you've done is you've reset their frame of reference.
It's the sorbet to clean the palate between meals.
Exactly, yeah.
Between
and
courses,
you can get so close to it that no matter what you do, everything looks wrong. We all have days like that as well. But so I found that it's very important to just kind of keep it in perspective. It's all about perspective.
I mean, as the colorist, I think that especially earlier in my career, less experienced, and I don't know if it's just a trend in the industry generally, but in the early days of my career, and especially in the circles I was moving in, there were some very powerful personalities, directors, who basically saw a young talented person, like, hey, this person can do it, but I'm going to put them in manual mode. I'm just going to control this person for 5 hours and tell them exactly what I want. And that, as a junior, you learn so much. Like but it's a high speed train, and you're struggling to keep up with that, and it's quite it's draining.
I've had some bad experiences of that as well.
Of course, abusive, totally, and I think the industry's changed a lot.
Well, I had I remember when I was in Thailand, I had a situation where, how it is in Thailand, like clients always turn up, a bit like Italy actually, but clients always turn up like 4 hours late or something, and then they say, the first thing they say is, well, let's have dinner, and you're just like, can we just
take it
start?
Easy? Take it easy.
So this was a high-end commercial, and the editor came in, and the client wasn't there, and he said, "Oh, I'll act as the client. I know what they want." Very egotistical, and he did, the thing that drives me crazy. Instead of telling me, I want the sky to be blue, he would say, "Oh, can you put a window in the top right-hand corner and do this, or can you do a secondary isolation on that and change the hue
about 4 degrees." Yeah.
And so this went on for about half an hour or so, and the pictures were, well, there are two problems really. One is scene to scene it didn't match, and the other is I was really not happy with the images. And I've always said to my assistants and colorists that I've trained, don't let anything go out of the room that you're not happy to put your name on. Because when somebody else sees that, they are not going to think, oh, but that's what he was told to do. They're just going to think you did a terrible job. So don't let anything out the room. So I was faced in this position, where we're nearly an hour into the thing. The client hasn't turned up and it's looking awful. And I thought, well, by my own rules, I can't put my name to this. And so I said to the editor, I said, look, you obviously know what you want to do. Sit in front of the controls. I'll tell you where things are. You do it. And then there was this kind of shocked silence and this, no, you have to do it. And I said, well, look, I understand what you're trying to do, but this is not the way that I would do it. And we need to go back. And he kind of didn't say another word for the whole time. The clients came in and hated it anyway, so we had to start over.
Yeah.
But, which was a good thing. But yeah, so if you're listening to this and you're not a colorist, but you're a client of a colorist, tell people what you want or what you're trying to achieve. Don't tell them how to do it. You wouldn't go to a hairdresser and tell them, what scissors to use and, where to start shaving your head and stuff like that. That's what you're paying them for.
Yeah.
If you're telling them how to do their job, then really you should be doing it yourself. So I feel quite strongly on that.
It's that balance of collaborator versus just operator.
As a director, you wouldn't book a cameraman and then tell them, I want to use these lenses and this camera, and oh, by the way, this is your exposure setting. And that's not how you work. That's not how you get the best out of a cinematographer.
Yeah.
So don't do that to other people.
Yeah, just on there's one more of those things we used to do, the unconventional things. I remember putting neg on the Telecine and telling the Telecine that it was actually interpose or low-con pose, and then flipping it back. And as far as I know, I think on some of the ranks there was actually an optical filter which would roll in. So there was actually, other than actually just inverting the thing, there was actually some optical differences.
Well, no, I'll tell you what it was. When you're working from negative to positive, you're actually doing two things. One, of course, is you're inverting the polarity. Okay, that's fine. You can easily do that with the grading controls.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that mask, that orange mask. You have to matrix out that orange mask.
Yeah.
And so when you did that idea of treating a negative as a positive and trying to grade it out, you were inverting the polarity, but you weren't taking out that mask. And in fact, with the early telecines, that was one of the problems with interpositives, was that they didn't have a very good matrix or filter to get rid of the orange mask.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had these kind of like creamy highlights and things. Yeah, so I was never a big fan of doing that, but yeah, we did try that. And the other thing that we tried to do was cross-processing. And the only really good way I ever found of doing cross-processing was with the custom curves, where you could actually cross-process it, because you could cross the curves over. The trackballs and the knobs would never let you do that. That was kind of one of the no-nos, that you should never do that.
Right.
So you could only do that with the curve tool. I'm trying to think of other things that we used to do with the telecines, though. I mean, changing the speed was quite fun. We had a lot of fun because we had the noise reduction was an off-board device, and it was based. So that did happen, and it was an off-board device because it had to have the frame store that you were talking about earlier.
Right.
And if you turned off the motion detector, you get these wonderful sort of motion blur effects. I once did a fashion shoot where they walk up the catwalk and then they freeze. Well, if you do that with the motion blur turned off, you get motion blur as they're walking, and then as they freeze on the catwalk, the whole image becomes
solidified,
solid and real again. Yeah. And that was a fantastic show. And occasionally I would get to talk with, like at the end of every job, you'd talk to the director or the cinematographer, and they'd say, have you got any ideas for the next one? And so occasionally you could do what we do today, where you talk to the cinematographer in advance. Wasn't as scientific or as controlled as it is today, but you could sort of run some tests with what you had just done and say, you could do this. And one of my favorite music videos was at around the time that secondary isolation on the Davinci was quite new. There was a big difference between the way Poggle worked and the way Davinci worked. So with the Poggle,
other than marks on the last frame of the shot rather than the first frame of shot.
Well, other than the time management. But what it was that with the Davinci, you could take the saturation to 0 and then put back individual colors. And with the Poggle, it was the other way around. You had to take down the individual colors because once the saturation was at 0, it would never come back. So it's like a processing order thing.
Yeah.
And so there's some quite cool things that we could do, because to do that in visual effects was very, very expensive in those days. Some of the commercials did it, but you wouldn't be able to afford it for a music video. And so this guy came in and he said, look, here's what I want. I want to have the artist in color and everybody else in black and white. And I said, okay, but I can't afford to comp it. So is there a way that you can do it in the grade? And I said, if you light everybody with blue light and you put a warm light on the artist, I can take out all the blue and just put the warm colors. I can then color balance the warm colors so that they look natural. And then you'd have a black and white image with just the artist in color. And you could have people walking in front of the artist. and they would still be black and white, and we would do it all in real time.
Yeah.
And it worked brilliantly. And so then they said, we've got another idea now. If we put the lights on dimmers, can we have different people popping up in color? And so we did pretty much the same thing, but they had, they would drop a blue filter over the spotlights.
Right.
And then I think there was like a 3 artists or something. And as each one wanted to come to the fore, then they would just change the spotlight, and then that would happen in real time in the grading. And it was brilliant. And it was
brilliant, like a very analog kind of
really
effect,
expensive.
Yeah?
Well, yes, it did, because if you analyzed it frame by frame, you actually saw the color temperature changing as it went down to black and white. But so, yeah, I really enjoyed those types of things. And then, later when I was in software grading and we were working in cinema, we would try sort of similar things. It was always, you want it to look like cinema. It's got to have that film look, even though it's digital projection. But we try these kind of subtle things, like slightly cyan skies, or slightly desaturated skin tones, or these sort of subtle things that you couldn't quite put your finger on, but it made it a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a point I've been wanting to bring up, because all these these new phases that come up, all these different stages that the industry goes through. The one that I really remember is when going from standard definition to 1920 high definition. I felt scared to grade it. It was almost like, wow, that's so interesting on its own. And for a period when we started working in HD, I felt that grades got very tame and very natural, because the resolution itself was enough of a shock, was something new that it's like our hands got limp and we couldn't push it as hard anymore, or something like that. Maybe it was because we saw more resolution in the highlights, so we wanted them to be smoother, and it's a funny evolution. This new tool comes along and you feel a bit lame.
Yeah. And that's why I say I think that we haven't got to that stage with HDR yet, where we actually need to do less to it, and we're kind of pushing it too hard. But to go back to that period of HD, remember though that there was a period of about 2 years when the I forget what it's called now, but there was a sort of a Spirit telecine that had HDR in it, but it could be controlled by a Davinci or a Pandora, but Davinci and Pandora didn't have HD processing yet. So there was a period of about 2 years when
high quality scans,
particularly so for feature film mastering, where the studios wanted HD masters, this was before we had HD TVs, you could only use telecine controls to get those masters. So you couldn't do the sort of things that we were doing, and you were sort of forced
scans
back.
And then they'd go and grade it in the flame.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the present. I mean, are you doing mostly short form or long form? And I'm really interested, you were talking about this whole testing process, because look design and getting more out of things, and just having a day to play prior to the actual shoot. I've seen how productive that is on various productions, but surely if you're essentially in charge of that whole thing and that coordination between pre and post, you must have some interesting insights. So tell us all about it.
Yeah, well, that's a long discussion.
Do tests,
but it's very rewarding. It is very rewarding having that sort of relationship. And I'm in a privileged but sort of somewhat frustrating sometimes position, because it is introducing the finishing colorist to the cinematographer. So for the mission shows, I'm just in between, right? I don't get to make the look.
Right.
I don't get to do the grading. All I'm doing is testing it. So typically the look will be sent back to set as a LUT.
Right.
And the first point to do is to lock down the color science, so that we're either working with sort of ARRI camera space, or you're working in ACES color space, or you have to set the color space, and then you can set the look. And so my job is really twofold. It's first of all to check that the LUT that's being created is fit for purpose.
Right.
And sometimes we'll need different versions of it. Like if you want to put the LUT in camera, then that's going to be different than if you're running it through live grade, for example.
Right.
Now, the colorist doesn't really have to do all of that. Most of them now have got this down pat, so they will deliver a whole set of LUTs that fits every purpose. But my job will be, first of all, to check. There's a number of things that I'll check. I mean, the first one is that you're not going to get banding or aliasing or any sort of horrible clipping that is unwanted. Once it passes that test, my second check is this going to pass through HDR or not?
Right.
Because a lot of times, particularly if it's what we call at Mission a legacy workflow, in other words, you're using camera color science rather than something like ACES, what will happen is that the 709 roll-off is baked into that LUT.
Right.
Now, in theory, if you wanted to get an HDR output, you would need a different show LUT. And in theory, that's possible. But a lot of times, it's that whole Stockholm syndrome thing, with editing. If you don't get it right in the first LUT, then they don't want to see it HDR because they built in an SDR look into the program.
Yeah, and they lit it seeing that roll off.
Yeah, so they when it comes to doing an HDR pass, they don't want it to get bright because they've lit it for that roll-off, as you say, and that roll-off is what they expect. Yeah. And they're right to want that because that's been their workflow.
That's the choice, yeah.
It's a little easier if you separate it, and it was nice to see LogC4 and the ARRI 35, the Alexa 35, adopt a similar process where you create, I think they call it a CMT, Creative Modulation Transform or something. The CMT is basically the same as an LMT, and then your output color science is separate. So you can choose to see it in HDR or SDR.
I mean, have you got enough HDR monitors on set? Are you getting enough jobs with HDR monitors on set?
So that hasn't been happening as standard because up till now, there's a premium for putting HDR monitors on set,
right.
Not just in terms of cost, but we talked about this earlier, the energy requirements and the portability of these bigger monitors. But this year with quantum dot OLEDs, the cost has come down. The energy efficiency is way, way better. You can run them off batteries. The only thing is the screen size is perhaps bigger than we're used to putting on a cart, but that's much more manageable now. So I think we're just beginning to see a lot more productions doing hybrid monitoring on set. We still have problems because we've still got to deliver SDR to the editors. God knows why. But as long as we have to deliver SDR to the editors, that does have an impact on the CDLs that we build. Right. But still, I mean, that's what I've been doing. To go back to your question, what am I grading? It's not really short form. It's mostly independent movies, not necessarily 90 minutes, although some of them are, but it's more for film festivals where they don't really want to go to a full-on facility. They don't have tight timelines, and we can talk more about what they're trying to achieve and kind of work more creatively.
Yeah, boutique personal experience, sure.
So that tends to be most of the grading. But then I get other things as well. So like in a little while, I'll be going to the Middle East to prepare a live show where everything gets rehearsed ahead of time. And it's becoming increasingly common now where it's a live show, but if it goes wrong, they can switch to the rehearsals and nobody will know the difference.
Milli vanilli.
And it requires an enormous amount of prep. Luckily, the weather conditions are pretty consistent, so we can take that into account. But we can only do these rehearsals. Yeah, well, but you can only do these rehearsals at the correct time of day because the shadows and everything has to be perfect.
Right.
So I've done this a couple of times before, and so that's kind of fun. And of course, I'm doing a lot of teaching now. My teaching courses now are based around color management rather than in the earlier stages, it was you teach somebody how to use the color corrector, and then the advanced classes. And now you've got these color management tools. I realized it was such a stress to get from I know how to use the color corrector and color management messes me up. There was such a stretch, and yet color management is what we've always wanted. It's that standard starting point, start here. So for the last 12 months, really, I've focused on teaching color management first and not teaching it uniquely to colorists, but trying to involve DITs and cinematographers and directors
You're talking about workflow. It's everyone. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's why I think colorists are so well positioned almost to be visual effects supervisors or to become producer or whatever if they want to branch out, because they're so well positioned to understand workflow, especially if they've been exposed to photography and, how that side works.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly how I ended up at Mission. They basically said, well, I think my original job description was, would you be able to make an IDT for some new camera, like a Nikon Z9 or something going into Aces, or a GoPro into Alexa or something. The target was quite a straightforward target. But I've really sort of seen this as an opportunity to collaborate with cinematographers, to talk about HDR, to talk about color management, to push this idea that the camera or the color management is not the thing that determines the look. That is something that is entirely up to the artists, the cinematographers, and including hair and makeup and costume design. That's all part of it.
Yeah.
And that's been very rewarding. So I kind of enjoy that side of it.
I guess it works as a kind of an inspirational gelling effect, that if people aren't just seeing the 709 or not just something that the DIT's cooking up on the day, but if it's really embodies the mood boards and everything, and it puts you in 1920 and or whatever the look of the film is, I think it can have a very motivating and inspiring effect on the whole crew. And
it's such good value, because you can say to them, like, imagine you're doing a 2-strip process, for example. You can say, well, don't put blue on it. Don't put people in denim or anything like that, because that wouldn't read well in that environment. And if you look at films like 2-strip Technicolor films like The Robe, you see that they just avoided blue. They didn't point the camera at the sky. They didn't put people in blue costumes. They put them in almost sort of Star Wars Jedi type earth colors,
right?
Because that's what would work well.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of take all of this history and use it for something completely new in a situation where it is a new idea, but it's actually an old technique, but you've appropriated it for the right cause.
It's some kind of color blindness. You're missing one cone.
Well, for the 2-strip process, yes, but I mean, I think HDR is just because we've really been hand tied in the HDR world, because people are either trying to recreate their SDR experiences, or they can't monitor it on set, so they can't really plan for things.
Yeah.
And so colorists have been the very at the front of HDR development. But hopefully now that we're getting I think there's 2 things that have happened this year with the quantum dot OLEDs. And I know there are discussions about how good quantum dot OLEDs are, and or whether they're reference and the rest of it. But that's missing the point. For me, the point is 2 things. One is they're affordable so that more people have access to it. And that was definitely a limiting factor in the past. And secondly, that we now have a single technology that is fit for purpose on set, because you can put it on a battery and reach 1,000 nits and see proper HDR on set. And the same technology is reference mode for grading, and you can do your metadata trims, even your dynamic trims for Dolby Vision or HDR Vivid or HDR10 Plus, whatever. You can do your metadata trims on the same technology, and that technology actually exists in consumer devices.
Right.
So you can say, well, it's got local dimming on it.
More and more, yeah.
Yeah, but everybody's going to see it with local dimming. I'm not grading it for somebody in 10 years' time. Who knows what they're going to have in 10 years' time? I'm grading it for what people see now. And so I really, personally, this is a personal opinion, and no, it's not shared by a lot of facilities, but I want to be working on something that is at least reasonably compatible with what people see at home. For me, that's my reference, not some bit of paper that says, we're going to use 10% of a 10,000 nit container. No, I want to be able to kind of judge. And if somebody's going to see local dimming at home, I want to see it, or at least be aware of it. If it's a flashing light or something, fine. I need to know about it so that I can grade around that and make sure that the experience in the home is as close as possible to what I'm doing in the suite. For me, that's what I'm charged with doing.
Yeah.
So this is very, very a very, very exciting time in the rollout towards HDR. we've got more and more HDR devices, phones, tablets, computers, and monitors.
Mm-hmm.
But now for the first time, we could actually have affordable monitoring, even in visual effects. Sometime in the next month or so, we're going to start seeing quantum dot OLEDs for under $2,000.
Right.
And that, for me, is something that you could put in front of 20 visual effects artists. It's not reference. It's not full-on reference that we'd put in the grading suite, but it's the same technology, and it's close with a bit of calibration. It's close enough to give you exactly the experience of what's going to happen later. And that's a game changer for me. Now we could have HDR in the grading suite and in the edit suite and in visual effects and in on set and color manage them to be very, very similar. There'll still be, obviously difficulties in terms of getting it to the executives, putting the dailies platforms up.
Yeah, there's knock-on effects. Yeah,
there's legacy. There's still a relatively small part of the market. So I'm not saying that it's going to happen overnight, but that's quite an exciting change. And so we were talking about limitations and new things that we can do. There's a whole ton of things that we haven't even touched on with HDR yet.
Right.
In terms of doing exciting things that an audience has never seen before.
Yeah, I mean, the thing the new technology comes out like 3D, stereoscopic 3D, then everything's like axes coming straight at you, like poking out the camera and things like that.
But this is not like that.
There's a maturity that needs to come into the whole HDR workflow.
Sure. I have to just say I'm very reluctant to use 3D as an analogy, because 3D was a sort of an add-on gimmick to sell more.
Way more gimmicky
devices. The difference between 3D and HDR is that all the factories that make screens, and there's only a handful of those around the world, they don't make SDR screens, because they can make HDR screens and you can decide to use them for SDR products.
Yeah.
But all the screens are HDR. So the phones, even like in-car dashboards now, those are all HDR screens.
Right.
And, I have a 7-year-old son. By the time he's a teenager, I suspect that he will be so accustomed to HDR on devices that to see SDR would be the equivalent of you and I looking back at a VHS tape, or perhaps an older generation looking back to black and white movies.
Right.
That's not to say that there's anything wrong with black and white, but my point is you can have black and white on an HDR display.
Beautifully, yeah.
You can't have color on a black and white display, and you can't have HDR on an SDR display.
Yeah.
So we have to get to that point. And we are getting there because, we don't have a choice. It's not like you can choose to have an SDR or an HDR TV. Increasingly, you can only buy HDR. You may not use it.
Yeah.
You may choose not to use it.
Right.
But you are going to have HDR capability. So there will be, a period of obsolescence where people will still be using the same TV they had, for the last 10 years. That changeover is going to take time. But any content maker that does not consider HDR as the future is really missing a trick.
Yeah, you can design your look inside it. Yeah. No, I think that's we're definitely past the push it out to the 2020 primaries and crank it to 1,000 nits. I assume there's a level of maturity coming in now where use it as you like. It's a bigger space, and you can just use the smaller part of that space. Up to you.
I think honestly, my opinion is that the biggest problem today is that the studios insist on 2 masters.
Yeah.
See, that's the bit that's different. And it's not new, because it did happen in the transition from black and white to color. And it did happen in the transition actually from cinema to, software grading. When like I say, there was that period where the DVD master would be quite different from the cinema master, because you could do so much more in the video grading that you couldn't do in the lab grading. So at the moment, the studios and the broadcasters are saying, well, we want an SDR master and we want an HDR master, and they have to be different. And artistically, that's hard to understand, because, if you compare it to, say, Letterbox, you can, with Letterbox, you can say, well, it's scope, but now we've got to do a 16:9 version, or we're just going to lose a whole load of stuff and it's going to look weird. It's like that with HDR. If you've chosen to make an SDR master, well, then it should probably stay an SDR master. You can still make an HDR copy that doesn't go above 100 nits.
Container, yeah. Just a HDR container, yeah.
And that would be a creative choice. And in my classes, I talk about, take a Wes Anderson movie, for example.
Yeah.
I don't really know how you would turn a Wes Anderson movie into HDR, because he uses that sort of flat, quite visible colors, but they're actually quite pastel.
Yeah.
They're not vibrant colors, and they're usually not primary colors.
Yeah.
So there will be some people whose look is an SDR look, and that's a creative decision. You shouldn't force them to have an HDR equivalent and poke a few highlights up into HDR. That's kind of like fake HDR. But equally, there will be what I like to think of as showcase HDR. Think of something like Pleasantville or Sin City, where it's black and white, and then a splash of color comes in, or Schindler's List, where the road coat comes in.
Right.
Well, how cool would it be to have an SDR story or narrative that suddenly kicks into HDR for some reason that is related to the text? Imagine a modern day version of The Wizard of Oz.
Right.
The Wizard of Oz goes from black and white to color in the opening sequence. But imagine, you go into an HDR world from an SDR world.
Right.
That would be kind of the modern equivalent of that. And we haven't really touched on using HDR for storytelling yet. And I think there's a lot of potential there. It's going to be a lot of fun. And there's colors that, we are not able to recreate in the SDR world.
You said because of the extra headroom, yeah.
And so we can do that. So it's very exciting, and it's a little frustrating because it's taken us, we've had HDR deliverables for about 8 years, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of using HDR to tell the story as opposed to using HDR for effect. But it will come.
Well, yeah, I think one of the concerns is you don't want to stick the knife in to cinema as a concept, as a social, as a habit of what people do. But presumably, we're also on that trajectory where you will not be able to buy a cinema projector within 5 years that cannot do HDR and cannot be 4K.
Well,
and. So maybe you're going to have 300 nits in cinema.
Hold on there.
Okay.
So yes, there are, Christie and Barco are both trying to push HDR projection.
Yeah.
And why are they trying to push that? Well, because they want to, obviously keep cinema alive. But I've had some experience. So at Mission, we have a DCP projector, a Christie projector. It's a small room, I admit. But when I went there, I was like, well, I can't work with this projector, because as soon as you put a picture on the screen, your black level just, the room lights up. The light bouncing off the screen increases the ambient light, and your black level goes. So I had a calibrator come in, and he said, well, but that's the DCI spec. You're in spec. What do you want to do? And I said, well,
yeah.
But here's the trouble. I'm grading on a Sony HX310 monitor with really solid blacks. And I look up at that projection.
2 extra decimal places of black. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, and I'm looking after that projection, and all I want to do is crush the blacks down, and of course that just messes up my grade. So we spent a year trying to figure out ways, and we did all sorts of things. We took out the safety glass. That was having a kind of a big haze effect. So we did that. We took anything reflective out of the room. The room is pretty dark in terms of decor and stuff.
Vanta black.
We didn't go all the way to black 2.0, although I've heard of people doing that. But I wasn't convinced that would really solve the problem, because it's the light on the screen that's the problem. It's in other words, it's not static contrast, it's dynamic contrast.
Yeah.
It's fine if you send black to the screen, the room's dark.
Yeah.
But as soon as you put any light on the screen, your blacks get lifted.
Right.
So anyway, to cut a long story short, we ended up putting in a 70% gray screen.
Right.
And what you have to do then is you have to increase the brightness out of the projector to get your foot Lamberts back up. But the gray screen doesn't bounce the light back into the room so much. So we went, I think the DCI spec for contrast on a screen, dynamic contrast, is about 100:1. And we've got it at 190:1. So we're nearly twice the contrast of a regular cinema screen.
Right.
But it's within DCI spec, so it's still DCI, and it's much more acceptable when you're comparing it against any sort of a modern reference monitor.
Deep black OLED.
And it looks great. And people have started to notice that, we get people coming in to do visual effects tests and lens tests and things like that. And they won't use the bigger projection screens, even though they're standard, DCI spec, but just because it's as a reference, it's a better reference. So going back to your premise of HDR projection, there is a DCI spec for HDR in the cinema. My personal thought is that there is no way that you will ever get a true HDR projector, and that we have to move to direct view. And I know there's all sorts of problems with audio and stuff, but
right.
Direct view is the only way that cinema can survive in the future, in my opinion.
Yeah, but please prove me wrong. And I'm not, for some reason in my gut, I feel that LEDs where we're heading eventually. We're going to go through a bunch of other things. We may end up there. Anyway, but yeah, that's all interesting. Cool, Kevin. We've chatted about a lot of things. Oh, my last thing is, do you remember, are you aware that just in case colorists of old lost their jobs, they could become, what do you call it, train conductors, because they used to have hole punches. They could punch tickets on trains.
Yes.
We used to have hole punches to punch a hole in the first frame of negative. We were allowed to damage one frame on every big roll, the first frame. We had to damage it.
The hole punch, yeah. Well, and there was that whole period of computer match where instead of, sitting on 10 or 12 cans of original camera negative, they would take all that, cut it down to the selected takes, put it in a new roll and punch it and send you what the time code should be. And then they would create a new edit list. So that you could transfer 20 minutes for a commercial instead of trying to put up 10 or 11 hours of film.
Right.
And the trick was that they gave you the new time code and the new EDL to make it conform, which is kind of, what we need to do in DI, really. But nobody's kind of picked that up yet.
Yeah, can't AI just do conforming for us? Couldn't we just work that out?
There is a feature. Where did I see this now? I can't remember whether it was. I think it might have been in film, in Baselight 7, they have a feature where that situation where you do a speed ramp or a resize or something, and it's never quite perfect because the machine you're using is not the one that they did.
Oh, wonderful.
So it goes back. In the worst case scenario is if you can't, if the edit parameters don't come in and make it perfect, it basically interpolates the frames to make it exactly the same as the offline.
Yeah.
So AI does get involved in stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, what you spoke about previously was the wonders of key code. The key code that was how they.
Yeah. Well, I thought when you said conductors and punching holes, I thought you were going to go back to the lab timers who would have punch tape.
Oh right. Yeah.
The original lab timing was done on punch tape.
Yeah, I supervised a film out in the kind of that digital finish, but then film out, and yeah, I had new respect for film timers because it's literally, okay, well, which one are you going to choose? You got 6 levels of 6 colors, and you got a little magnifying glass to look at the frame and make the decision.
And the thing about lab timers is they had no way of knowing what it was going to look like until the next day.
Just experience.
Yeah.
Experience. Straight up
just experience. Yeah. They had to totally work blind. And, the greatest respect for them, because they would have to do it, and a day later they would see if they got it right or not, and then go back and do it again, and the director would come in and say, or the DP would come in and say, oh, that's, we need a bit more red in that scene, or the scene needs to be a bit darker. And they would have to convert that into numbers and then punch bit of paper. And I always remember, like in the early days when you got the negative, that piece of punched paper would be in the can.
Right, yeah.
And that would be an instruction. Totally useless to us, of course. But you used to see those bits of paper.
Right next to the dot matrix printer.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool, Kevin. Thanks so much for your time.
I appreciate it. It's really been very enjoyable reminiscing. There's fewer and fewer people you can kind of go back and remember how we got to where we are and why we believe the things that we do. It's different for each generation. So it's quite nice sharing memories.
Yeah, no, it's important for people to hear this, I think.
Thanks, Paul.
Have a good day, Kevin. Cheers.
Thanks again for listening to the Color Mentor podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can leave comments on Patreon or Instagram. The Instagram handle is color.mentor. And remember to head over to the Color Mentor page on patreon.com and check out the goodies there. We'll see you next time.